On a morning in the spring of 1034, a young man stood at the rail of a ship entering the Bosphorus Strait, and what he saw changed everything he understood about the world. He was 28 years old. He had been fighting since he was 15. He had killed men in Norway, in Sweden, in the endless marshes of what would one day be called Russia. He had watched his half-brother die at the Battle of Stiklestad, had fled across frozen mountains with an arrow wound in his side, had spent 2 years in the service of the Grand Prince of Kiev, leading raids against steppe nomads whose names he could not pronounce. He thought he understood power. He thought he understood wealth. He thought he understood what a city could be. He was wrong. The ship rounded a final headland, and Constantinople rose before him like something from the sagas of the gods. But the gods lived in wooden halls. This was something else entirely. Walls of stone stretched for miles along the waterfront, interrupted by towers that seemed to touch the sky. Behind them, rooftops and domes climbed the hills in terraces of red tile and gleaming gold. At the city's heart, vast enough to be visible from the harbor, the dome of the Hagia Sophia floated above the skyline like a second sun. The morning light struck it and scattered, and for a long moment the young Norseman could not speak. The city held perhaps 500,000 people. Paris, at that moment, held perhaps 20,000. London, perhaps 15. The largest city the young man had ever seen was Kiev, which numbered perhaps 10,000 souls, and had seemed to him a wonder of the world. Constantinople was not a city. It was a civilization condensed into a single point, the accumulated wealth of 8 centuries of empire piled onto 7 hills at the edge of 2 continents. The young man's name was Harald Sigurdsson. He had come to this place with 500 warriors at his back, seeking employment. Within 20 years, he would return to Scandinavia with enough gold to finance the conquest of Norway. He would become king. He would invade England. He would die at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, and his death would mark the end of the Viking Age itself. But all of that lay in the future. On this morning, Harald Sigurdsson was merely one more young Northman arriving at the capital of the world, hoping to trade his sword arm for Byzantine gold. He was not the first. He would not be the last. For nearly 500 years, from the late 9th century to the middle of the 14th, men like him made this journey. They came from the frozen fjords of Norway, from the islands of Denmark, from the forests of Sweden, from the scattered Norse settlements in Iceland and the British Isles. They crossed the Baltic, traveled up the great Russian rivers, portaged their ships across the watersheds, and descended toward the Black Sea. At the end of that journey, at the terminus of a route that stretched 3,000 miles from the North Atlantic to the Eastern Mediterranean, they found Constantinople. And Constantinople found uses for them. They called themselves the Varangians. The Byzantines called them the Varangian Guard. They served as the personal bodyguard of the emperor himself, the most trusted soldiers in the most sophisticated empire on earth. The same people who had been burning monasteries in Northumbria were now standing watch in the throne room of the Basileus, protecting the man who styled himself God's representative on earth, the ruler of the Roman Empire that had never fallen. This is one of the strangest transformations in medieval history. It is a story about violence and money, about what happens when the warriors of one civilization discover that another civilization will pay them more than they could ever steal. It is a story about identity and assimilation, about Northmen who learned Greek and converted to Orthodox Christianity and named their sons after Byzantine saints, while never quite ceasing to be what they had been. It is a story about institutional genius, about an empire that understood that the best bodyguards are the ones with no local loyalties, no family connections, no political ambitions of their own. And it is a story about what happened next. Because the Varangian Guard did not simply protect the emperor, they shaped him. They deposed him. They placed his successor on the throne. For 5 centuries, these northern strangers stood at the absolute center of Byzantine power, close enough to touch the purple. And what they did with that proximity tells us something essential about the nature of empire itself. To understand the Varangian Guard, we must first understand the world that produced them. We must understand why a young Scandinavian warrior in the 9th or 10th or 11th century would leave his home and travel 3,000 miles to serve a foreign emperor. We must understand what pushed them out and what pulled them in. And we must understand the empire they found at the end of that journey, what it wanted from them, and why it trusted them with the emperor's life. The sources for this history are fragmentary, multilingual, and often contradictory. We have Byzantine chronicles written in Greek by court historians with their own agendas. We have Norse sagas composed centuries after the events they describe, mixing history with legend in ways that are often impossible to untangle. We have runic inscriptions carved on stones scattered across Scandinavia, brief memorials to men who died far from home. We have a single famous piece of graffiti, scratched into the marble balustrade of the Hagia Sophia by a bored Northman during a church service, reading simply, "Halfdan was here." The same impulse that drives teenagers to carve their names into bathroom stalls, preserved now for 1,000 years. We have, in other words, fragments, glimpses, traces. From these incomplete materials, we must reconstruct a story that lasted half a millennium and transformed 2 civilizations. We cannot know everything, we cannot know most things, but we can know enough to understand why this happened and what it meant. The story begins in violence. In the year 793, Scandinavian raiders attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria, in what is now northeastern England. The monks who survived wrote letters to their ecclesiastical superiors describing what had happened, and those letters preserve for us the shock of a civilization encountering something it had no framework to understand. The attackers came from the sea. They came without warning. They did not negotiate, did not demand tribute, did not seek terms. They simply killed. They killed the monks. They killed the servants. They desecrated the altars and tore the gold bindings from the sacred books. They loaded their ships with everything portable and valuable, and then they left, sailing back into the northern mists from which they had emerged. The scholar Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne, declared that such a thing had never been seen before in the Christian world. He was not entirely correct. Coastal raiding was as old as ships themselves, but he was capturing something real about the scale and audacity of what was happening. For the next 2.5 centuries, these Northmen would be the nightmare of Western Europe. They sacked Paris, they conquered half of England, they settled Normandy and Sicily and southern Italy. They colonized Iceland and Greenland, and briefly, the coast of North America itself. They extracted such vast quantities of silver from the Frankish kingdoms in tribute payments that modern archaeologists find more Carolingian coins in Scandinavian soil than in French. But violence was not the only Scandinavian export. While the raiders went west, the traders went east. The geography of Scandinavia faces 2 directions. The western coast looks toward the Atlantic, toward Britain and Ireland and the Frankish kingdoms. The eastern coast looks toward the Baltic, toward the river systems that drain into it, toward the vast forested interior of what is now Russia. And those rivers led somewhere. A Norse trader departing from the Swedish coast could sail across the Baltic to the Gulf of Finland. From there, he could ascend the Neva River to Lake Ladoga. From Ladoga, he could follow the Volkhov River south to Lake Ilmen and the trading settlement of Novgorod. From Novgorod, the routes diverged. He could continue south along the Dnieper toward the Black Sea and Constantinople, or he could turn east, following the Volga toward the Caspian Sea and the markets of the Islamic world. These were not easy journeys. The rivers were broken by rapids that required portaging, carrying ships and cargo overland, sometimes for miles. The forests were inhabited by Slavic and Finnish tribes who were not always friendly. The distances were immense, but the rewards were commensurate. At the end of the Volga route lay Atil, the capital of the Khazar Khanate, and beyond it, the great Islamic cities of Central Asia and Persia. At the end of the Dnieper route lay Constantinople itself. Both termini offered markets for the goods the Northmen carried: furs, honey, wax, amber, and most importantly, slaves. Both offered, in return, the thing Scandinavia did not produce: silver. The Arabic sources record these northern traders with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered a group of them on the Volga in 921, left the most detailed account. He described them as tall and fair, covered with tattoos from their fingertips to their necks. He described their hygiene practices, which horrified him. They washed their faces each morning in a communal basin, blowing their noses and spitting into the water before passing the bowl to the next man. He described their treatment of their slave women, which was casual and public. He described the funeral of a chieftain, which culminated in the sacrifice of a slave girl, her ritual rape by the deceased's companions, and her strangulation and stabbing by an old woman called the Angel of Death. Ibn Fadlan called these people the Rus. The etymology of that name is disputed. It may derive from an Old Norse word for rowing, or the men who row. It may come from a Finnish word for Swedes. The exact derivation matters less than the fact itself. By the early 10th century, Scandinavian traders and warriors had established themselves so thoroughly in the river systems of Eastern Europe that the entire region was beginning to take their name. The Rus would give their name to Russia itself. These Northmen were not merely passing through, they were settling, they were building. By the 9th century, they had established fortified trading posts along the river routes, Novgorod in the north, Kiev in the south. They were intermarrying with the local Slavic populations, adopting Slavic words and customs while maintaining their Scandinavian identities. They were creating, in effect, a hybrid culture that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and they were raiding. The distinction between trader and raider in this context was largely situational. A Northman descending the Dnieper with a cargo of furs might trade peacefully if the market price was good. If it was not, or if the opportunity presented itself, he might take what he wanted by force. The same ships that carried amber also carried weapons. The same men who bargained in market squares also burned villages. The line between commerce and violence was permeable, and most Northmen crossed it regularly. Constantinople became aware of these new arrivals in the most direct possible way. In June of 860, a fleet of 200 ships appeared in the Bosphorus without warning. The Byzantine Empire was at that moment engaged in a war with the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Emperor Michael III was away from the capital with most of the army. The city's defenses were skeletal. The Rus, for these attackers were undoubtedly the Northmen from the river routes, began systematically plundering the suburbs, the unfortified settlements that had grown up outside the city walls. They burned monasteries. They killed inhabitants. They demonstrated, as their cousins had demonstrated at Lindisfarne 67 years earlier, that they were entirely indifferent to the sanctity of Christian holy places. The Patriarch of Constantinople, a man named Photius, delivered 2 sermons during the siege that have survived. They preserve the terror of the moment. He described the attackers as coming from the ends of the earth, a people unknown to us, motivated by a savagery that seemed incomprehensible. He described the smoke rising from the suburbs, the bodies floating in the strait, the uncertainty of whether the walls themselves would hold. The walls held. The Rus, lacking siege equipment and apparently lacking the patience to maintain a prolonged blockade, eventually withdrew, sailing back up the Black Sea with their plunder. But their appearance had announced something that the Byzantines could not ignore. There was a new military power on the northern frontier, and that power had the ships and the warriors to threaten Constantinople itself. Over the next century and a half, the Rus attacked Constantinople several more times in 907, 941, and 944. None of these attacks succeeded in taking the city. The Byzantine walls remained essentially impregnable to forces without heavy siege equipment, but they demonstrated a persistence that demanded response. The Byzantines responded in the way they had always responded to dangerous neighbors. They sought to bind them with treaties, with trade agreements, with the subtle chains of mutual economic dependence. The treaties that resulted from these conflicts survive in the Byzantine Chronicle, known as the Primary Chronicle, and in Byzantine administrative texts. They reveal a relationship of increasing complexity. The Rus agreed to limit the number of their traders who could enter Constantinople at any one time. They agreed to surrender runaway slaves. They agreed to provide military assistance to the empire in exchange for preferential trading terms. The Byzantines, for their part, agreed to provide the Rus with supplies and markets and to allow their traders access to the city under carefully controlled conditions. These treaties contained something else as well, provisions for the employment of Rus warriors in Byzantine service. The logic was elegant. The Rus had demonstrated that they could not be ignored. They could be fought, but fighting them was expensive, and the results were uncertain. The northern warriors were skilled and numerous, and their base on the Dnieper was far enough away that a decisive victory would be difficult to achieve. What could not be defeated might be bought, and what was bought might become, in the right circumstances, useful. The Byzantine Empire in the 9th and 10th centuries was a sophisticated administrative state with a professional military establishment. But it had a problem that had plagued it for centuries. Its generals had a tendency to rebel. The empire's internal politics were characterized by palace coups, military revolts, and dynastic civil wars. Between 695 and 1081, a period of less than 4 centuries, the empire had 57 emperors, of whom only a small fraction died peacefully in their beds. The rest were deposed, exiled, blinded, murdered, or forcibly tonsured and confined to monasteries. In this environment of chronic political instability, the emperor needed bodyguards he could trust. The question was, who could be trusted? The answer was not obvious. Byzantine bodyguard units had a long history of becoming political actors themselves, trading their protection for influence and eventually turning on the emperors they were supposed to protect. The scholae, the elite palace guards who had served since the time of Constantine, had degenerated into parade ground soldiers more interested in political intrigue than military service. The excubatores, who had replaced them as the primary bodyguard unit, had themselves been implicated in multiple coups. It was an excubator commander who had murdered the Emperor Maurice in 602. It was excubatores who had helped depose Justinian Thicentu in 695. The problem was that native Byzantine troops, however loyal they might initially be, inevitably developed local connections, family ties, factional affiliations. They became enmeshed in the web of Byzantine patronage and politics. They acquired interests that diverged from the emperor's interests. And once a bodyguard had interests of his own, he could no longer be fully trusted. The solution was to recruit bodyguards who had no local interests at all. This was not a new idea. The practice of using foreign mercenaries as royal bodyguards is ancient and nearly universal. The logic is straightforward. A foreigner has no family in the country, no property, no faction, no patron except the king himself. His loyalty is purchased, and precisely because it is purchased, it is reliable. He has nothing to gain from the king's overthrow and everything to lose. The Persian kings had their immortals, recruited from subject peoples. The Ptolemaic pharaohs had their Macedonian guards. The caliphs of Baghdad would soon have their Turkish slave soldiers, the Mamluks, who would eventually seize power themselves, but served faithfully for generations before they did. The Byzantines had experimented with various foreign units over the centuries, but in the late 10th century they found the perfect candidates: the Northmen. The Rus offered everything the Byzantines needed. They were fierce warriors, proven in combat against the empire itself. They were physically distinctive, tall and fair-haired in a capital of dark-haired Greeks, which made them easy to identify and difficult to impersonate. They were culturally alien, with no existing connections to Byzantine aristocratic families or court factions. They came from far away, too far to maintain divided loyalties or to serve as agents for nearby foreign powers. And they could be bought. The northern warriors had demonstrated, through 2 centuries of raiding and trading, that they were entirely practical about the exchange of violence for wealth. They would fight for whoever paid them, and the Byzantine Empire could pay better than anyone. The formalization of this arrangement is traditionally dated to the year 988, during the reign of the Emperor Basil II. Basil was facing a rebellion. His general, Bardas Phocas, had declared himself emperor and was marching on Constantinople with a substantial army. Basil's own forces had proven unreliable. Many of them had defected to Phocas, and those who remained were of uncertain loyalty. The situation was desperate. The empire itself seemed about to fragment. Basil appealed to Vladimir, the Grand Prince of Kiev, the ruler of the Rus Confederation. The arrangement they reached was remarkable. Vladimir would provide 6,000 Varangian warriors to fight for Basil against the rebels. In exchange, Basil would give Vladimir his sister Anna in marriage, an astonishing concession since Byzantine princesses were almost never married to foreign rulers, and a marriage alliance with a barbarian prince was considered deeply shameful by the Byzantine court. Vladimir, for his part, agreed to convert to Orthodox Christianity and to impose Christianity on his people. The deal was struck. The Varangians arrived. At the Battle of Abydos in 989, they shattered Phocas's army. The rebel general was killed. Sources disagree on whether he died in combat or of a sudden seizure as he rode toward Basil's lines, but the result was the same. The rebellion collapsed. Basil's throne was secure. The 6,000 Varangians who had saved the empire did not go home. Basil kept them. He understood what he had in these northern warriors, a force that owed everything to him and nothing to the Byzantine aristocracy that had threatened him. He formalized their position. They became the Varangian Guard, the Tagmaton Varangion, the personal bodyguard of the emperor himself. They were stationed in the Great Palace, closer to the emperor than any other military unit. They guarded his bedchamber. They stood watch over his meals. They accompanied him to the hippodrome, to the cathedral, to war. They were, in effect, the human walls between the emperor and anyone who might wish to harm him. The arrangement worked. For the remaining 36 years of his reign, Basil II faced no serious challenges to his authority. He became the most successful military emperor in Byzantine history, expanding the empire's borders further than they had reached in 4 centuries, crushing the Bulgarian state that had threatened the Balkans for generations, earning the epithet Bulgar Slayer for his ruthlessness in victory. When he died in 1025, he left an empire at the height of its power and a treasury overflowing with gold. He also left an institution that would outlive him by 3 centuries. The Varangian Guard that Basil created was, in many ways, unprecedented. It was not simply a bodyguard unit. It was a self-perpetuating organization with its own traditions, its own privileges, its own identity. Varangians served for fixed terms, typically several years, after which they could return home with their accumulated pay and plunder. But the unit itself continued, constantly replenished by new recruits arriving from the north, each generation of warriors replacing the last in an unbroken chain of service. The Varangians enjoyed extraordinary privileges. Their pay was the highest in the Byzantine military establishment, several times what an ordinary soldier earned. They received regular bonuses on imperial anniversaries, coronations, and other ceremonial occasions. They had the right to enter the imperial treasury on the death of an emperor and take as much gold as they could carry in their arms, a privilege called the palace pillaging, which the sources describe with a mixture of horror and grudging respect. They had their own quarters in the Great Palace, their own chapel, their own legal procedures. They were, in effect, a state within a state, a northern enclave in the heart of the Greek capital. And they were not entirely Greek. This was the strangest thing about them, the thing that made them unique among Byzantine military units. The Varangians maintained their northern identity across generations. They spoke their own languages among themselves. Old Norse and later Old English after the Norman conquest drove Anglo-Saxon warriors into Byzantine service. They maintained their own religious practices, at least initially, and even after they converted to Orthodox Christianity, they retained distinctively northern forms of piety. They carved runic inscriptions on the marble of the Hagia Sophia. They named their children with Norse names. They sent money home to Scandinavia to fund memorial stones for fallen comrades. They were, in other words, something new in the medieval world, a professionalized foreign military elite transplanted thousands of miles from home, serving a foreign empire while maintaining their own cultural identity, generation after generation, for 500 years. How did this happen? How did the same people who had been burning monasteries in England become the trusted bodyguards of the Byzantine Emperor? How did the raiders become the guards? The answer lies in understanding what the Varangians were actually doing and what they were actually paid for. They were not primarily paid to fight. The Byzantine Empire had plenty of soldiers. It had the tagmata, the professional standing army of the capital region. It had the themata, the provincial forces that defended the empire's long frontiers. It had mercenaries of a dozen different nationalities: Turks, Armenians, Georgians, Normans, Pechenegs, Cumans. If fighting was all the empire needed, it could have found fighters closer to home. What the Varangians provided was something more specific and more valuable: absolute loyalty in the most dangerous place in the empire. The great palace of Constantinople was not merely a residence. It was the nerve center of the Byzantine state, the place where emperors lived and worked and made the decisions that governed millions of lives. It was also, for that very reason, the most dangerous place in the empire for an emperor to be. The palace was staffed by thousands of servants, officials, eunuchs, clergy, and soldiers, any of whom might be suborned by an ambitious general, a disgruntled aristocrat, or a rival claimant to the throne. The emperor's own family was often his greatest threat. Sons murdered fathers, brothers murdered brothers, nephews murdered uncles, in a seemingly endless cycle of dynastic violence. In this environment, the emperor needed men he could trust absolutely. And trust, in this context, meant something very specific. It meant men who had no reason to want him dead. The Varangians had no reason to want the emperor dead. They were foreigners. They could not become emperor themselves. The throne was restricted to Romans, and no amount of service would make a Northman into a Roman. They could not install a client on the throne and rule through him. They had no connections to any Byzantine faction that might produce an alternative emperor. They could not profit from political instability. Their entire position depended on the continuity of the institution that employed them. The emperor's death, especially a violent death, would mean at best disruption, and at worst the disbandment of the guard itself. The Varangians, in short, had interests that were perfectly aligned with the emperor's survival. This was their value. This was why they were paid so much. This was why they were trusted with access that no one else enjoyed, and they earned that trust. The historical record contains remarkably few instances of Varangian treachery. In a political culture defined by conspiracy and betrayal, the Northern Guards maintained an almost unbroken record of fidelity. When emperors were overthrown, and many emperors were overthrown, it was almost never by Varangian hands. The Guard typically fought to the last for the emperor they had sworn to protect, even when the situation was hopeless, even when the new regime offered them favorable terms. There is a famous story, probably legendary but symbolically accurate, about the Norman adventurer Robert Guiscard's war against the Byzantine Empire in the 1080s. According to the story, Guiscard's forces captured a Varangian prisoner and offered him rich rewards to change sides. The Normans and the Varangians were, after all, both of Scandinavian descent, and Guiscard thought he might appeal to ethnic solidarity. The Varangian supposedly replied that he would rather die than break his oath to the emperor. He was killed. The story may not be true in its details, but it captures something true about the Varangian self-image and about the reputation they cultivated. They were oath keepers. They were loyal unto death. They did not break. This reputation was worth more than gold. It was, in a sense, the product they were selling. A bodyguard who might betray you is not a bodyguard at all, but an assassin in waiting. The Varangians understood this. Their reliability was their brand, and they protected that brand ferociously. Any Varangian who betrayed an emperor would have destroyed not just his own honor, but the honor of the entire institution, and with it, the institution's value. The incentives aligned perfectly. The young man at the ship's rail, watching Constantinople rise before him, did not know any of this history in detail. Harald Sigurdsson had not read Byzantine administrative texts or studied the formation of the Varangian Guard, but he knew, in the way that practical men know things, that there was opportunity here. He knew that Northmen had been coming to this city for generations and coming home rich. He knew that the emperor paid well for good warriors. He knew that the alternative was returning to the brutal factional wars of Scandinavia, where he was a marked man, the half-brother of a dead king, a threat to whoever now sat on the Norwegian throne. He brought his 500 warriors to the recruiting offices. He presented his credentials. He was examined, tested, evaluated. And then Harald Sigurdsson became a Varangian. He would serve for nearly a decade. He would fight across the empire's vast expanse, in Anatolia against Arab raiders, in Sicily against Norman adventurers, in Bulgaria against rebels and bandits. He would participate in 18 major battles by his own later count. He would rise to command the entire guard, bearing the title of Spatharokandidatos, and then the still higher rank of Manglavites. He would accumulate wealth beyond anything his father could have imagined. Gold, silver, gems, silk, the concentrated luxury of the richest empire on earth. He would also see things that would stay with him forever. He would see the blinding of a defeated emperor, a man named Michael Vive, who had attempted to exile the Empress Zoe and found himself facing a popular uprising. The Varangians had been ordered to protect Michael, and they had obeyed, fighting against the mob that stormed the palace. But when Michael was captured and the new regime ordered his eyes put out, the Varangians stood aside. They had protected him while he was emperor. When he ceased to be emperor, their obligation ended. Harold watched the blinding. The chroniclers recorded that he was present. They do not record what he thought. But we can guess. The lesson of that day was unmistakable. In Constantinople, power was absolute but fragile. Emperors rose and fell on the whims of factions, of crowds, of military conspiracies. The man who commanded the empire one day might be a blinded prisoner the next. Loyalty to the emperor was not the same as loyalty to any particular man. It was loyalty to the institution, to the throne, to whoever sat upon it at any given moment. This was the world Harald Sigurdsson was learning to navigate. It was a world utterly unlike the one he had left in Scandinavia, where power was personal and loyalty was to individuals, where a king's men followed him to death and beyond. Here, in the heart of the Byzantine state, power was structural. It inhered in offices, not persons. And the Varangian Guard, the most personal of bodyguard units, was paradoxically the most impersonal of institutions, loyal to the purple, not to the man who wore it. The morning light had shifted as Harold's ship made its way toward the harbor. The dome of the Hagia Sophia no longer caught the sun directly. Now it glowed with reflected light from the water, a gentler radiance that still seemed to pulse with contained energy. Smaller domes surrounded it, chapels and outbuildings, creating a skyline that resembled nothing so much as a cluster of bubbles rising from the earth. The harbor itself was chaos ordered into function. Hundreds of ships rode at anchor, cargo vessels from Egypt carrying grain, galleys from the theme fleets, fishing boats by the dozen, the long, narrow warships called dromons that formed the backbone of the Byzantine navy. On the docks, longshoremen unloaded cargoes while customs officials checked manifests and collected duties. The sound of a dozen languages mingled in the salt air, Greek predominant, but also Arabic, Armenian, Georgian, Italian, Slavic tongues, and here and there the harsh consonants of Harold's own northern speech. The Norsemen on Harold's ship would have stood out immediately. They were taller than most of the people on those docks, broader in the shoulder, lighter in coloring. Their beards were long in the northern fashion, their hair often braided. They carried weapons openly, axes, swords, the long knives they called seaxes, and their bearing was that of men who expected to use them. They moved through the crowd with the particular alertness of warriors in unfamiliar territory, heads turning, eyes scanning, hands never far from hilts. They would not have been the only Northmen on those docks. By 1034, Varangians were a familiar sight in Constantinople. The city's inhabitants had learned to recognize them, to give them room on the crowded streets, to neither challenge nor provoke them. The Varangians had a reputation for heavy drinking and quick tempers, but also for a certain rough honor, a willingness to pay their debts and keep their bargains. Merchants sold to them readily. Tavern keepers welcomed their coin. Prostitutes valued their generosity. The path from those docks to the great palace, from arriving mercenary to trusted guardsman, was well established by the time Harold walked it. There were procedures, there were examinations, there were oaths. The oaths were the key. A man entering the Varangian Guard swore loyalty to the emperor in terms that were absolute and unambiguous. He swore to protect the emperor's person. He swore to obey the emperor's commands. He swore to reveal any conspiracy against the emperor's life or throne. He swore, in effect, to subordinate himself entirely to an institution and a man he had never met, in a language he did not speak, in a faith he had not yet adopted, in a city that was utterly unlike anything he had ever known. And thousands of men took that oath. Over 5 centuries, tens of thousands of Northmen passed through the Varangian Guard. They swore in Greek words they barely understood. They kissed icons of saints whose names they could not pronounce. They knelt before emperors whose titles seemed absurd to men, raised in the simple hierarchies of Scandinavian kingship. And then they served, and they fought, and they died, and they sent their gold home, and they were replaced by new men who took the same oaths and made the same promises and stood the same watches in the same marble halls. The transformation this represented was profound. A man who left Scandinavia as a young warrior, shaped by the values of the Norse world, personal loyalty, blood feud, death in battle as the highest honor, entered an institution that had entirely different assumptions about how human beings should relate to power. The Byzantine state did not ask for personal devotion. It asked for professional service. It did not care about a man's lineage or his feuds or his gods. It cared about his competence, his reliability, his willingness to follow orders. This was, in a sense, liberating. A Varangian in Constantinople was freed from the constraints of his birth. His father's enemies were thousands of miles away. His family's feuds were irrelevant. His social status in the Norse world, thrall, carl, or jarl, meant nothing here. What mattered was what he did, how he fought, whether he kept his oaths. The Byzantine Empire offered to men who had grown up in one of the most rigidly stratified societies in medieval Europe, something approaching a meritocracy. But it was also, in another sense, alienating. To serve the Byzantine Emperor was to enter a world where almost everything you knew was wrong. The language was incomprehensible. The religion was strange, even if nominally Christian. The icons, the liturgy, the theology, all of it was different from whatever Christianity a Northman might have encountered in the newly converted Scandinavian kingdoms. The food was foreign. The climate was shocking. Constantinople's summers would have been unbearably hot to men raised in the long, cool days of the northern latitudes. Even the most basic social interactions were conducted according to rules the Varangians did not know. How did they cope? The sources give us glimpses. They coped by banding together, by maintaining their own communities within the capital, by speaking their own languages and practicing their own customs behind closed doors. They coped by drinking. The Varangians' reputation for alcoholism is attested in multiple Byzantine sources, and it seems to have been genuinely remarkable, even by the generous standards of medieval military culture. They coped by fighting, by channeling their alienation into the violence that was, after all, their purpose and their profession. And they coped by adapting. Over time, over generations, the Varangians became something new. They were not Byzantines. They never became fully Byzantine, never fully assimilated into Greek culture, never lost their identity as Northmen. But they were not quite Scandinavians either. They occupied a liminal space, a cultural borderland, belonging fully to neither world but participating in both. This liminal identity would prove remarkably durable. It would survive shifts in the Guard's ethnic composition, as Scandinavians were gradually joined and then replaced by Anglo-Saxons fleeing the Norman conquest. It would survive changes in Byzantine politics, in imperial dynasties, in the empire's military fortunes. It would survive in some form until the empire itself began its long, final decline. Harold Sigurdsson did not know any of this when his ship entered the harbor. He could not have known it. The future is opaque even to those who will make it. He knew only that he was young, that he was strong, that he had 500 warriors at his back, and that the city before him contained more wealth than he had ever imagined. He would learn the rest. They all learned the rest. It was what Constantinople taught you, if you stayed long enough and watched carefully enough. The empire had been teaching barbarians for 7 centuries by the time Harold arrived. It would go on teaching them for 4 more. The lesson was always the same. Power could be purchased, but loyalty had to be earned. Competence mattered more than birth, and the walls that protected the emperor protected everyone who served him faithfully. The morning light on the water shifted again, and Harold's ship moved toward the dock, toward the city, toward a decade of service that would make him the richest and most famous Varangian in history. He stepped onto Byzantine soil for the first time. The transformation had begun. The city that swallowed Harold Sigurdsson in the year 1034 was not merely large. It was a different category of human settlement, a thing that existed in a separate ontological space from anything he had known. The Norse had towns, Birka, Hedeby, Kaupang, and these were substantial by northern standards, home to perhaps a few thousand people at their peak, crowded with merchants and craftsmen in the bustle of trade. Harald had seen Novgorod, which was larger still, sprawling along the Volkhov River with its wooden churches and merchant quarters. He had seen Kiev, where his sister's husband Yaroslav held court in something approaching Byzantine style, with stone churches and painted icons and Greek priests chanting in a language no one fully understood. None of it prepared him for this. Constantinople in the 11th century housed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. The numbers are uncertain. The Byzantines did not conduct censuses in the modern sense, but even the conservative estimates place it among the 3 or 4 largest cities on earth, rivaled only by the Chinese capitals and perhaps Baghdad in its glory days. To a man from Norway, where the entire population of the kingdom numbered perhaps 200,000 souls scattered across 1,000 miles of fjords and valleys, the scale was simply incomprehensible. More people lived in a single district of Constantinople than in the whole of his homeland. The city announced itself through all the senses simultaneously. The noise was inescapable. The cries of vendors in a dozen languages, the clatter of hooves and cartwheels on stone pavement, the bells of churches ringing the hours, the chanting of monks, the arguments of dock workers, the screams of animals being slaughtered in the public markets. The smell was equally overwhelming. Incense and rotting fish, perfume and sewage, baking bread and rendering fat, the salt tang of the sea mingling with the vegetable reek of the markets, and everywhere, pressing in from all sides, the crush of humanity. Bodies in motion, bodies at rest, bodies engaged in the 1,000 tasks that kept a metropolis alive. After the vast empty spaces of the North Sea and the relative quiet of the Rus rivers, the density of human presence must have felt almost threatening. But it was the architecture that would have struck deepest. The Norse built in wood. Even their finest halls, the seats of kings and jarls, were timber constructions, magnificently carved but impermanent, vulnerable to fire and rot, destined to be replaced every few generations. Constantinople built in stone. Stone churches, stone palaces, stone walls, stone forums, stone aqueducts carrying water from miles away, stone columns salvaged from ancient temples and repurposed for Christian glory. The buildings rose higher than anything in the north, 4 stories, 5 stories, great domed structures that seemed to defy the logic of gravity. And they had been standing for centuries. Some of the buildings Harold saw that first morning were older than Christianity in Scandinavia. The Hippodrome, where the chariot races were held, had been hosting crowds since the 4th century. The Hagia Sophia, the great church that dominated the skyline, had been completed in the year 537, 500 years before Harold's birth, and it remained the largest enclosed space in the world. The Hagia Sophia deserves particular attention because it would have been unlike anything a Northman could have conceived. Churches in Scandinavia, such as they existed in the 1030s, were small wooden structures, simple in design, unremarkable in ornamentation. The great stave churches that would later become Norway's architectural glory were not yet built. What Harold would have known as a church was a building perhaps 30 feet long, dimly lit, smelling of smoke and damp wood. The Hagia Sophia was 1,000 years of architectural ambition compressed into a single structure. Its central dome rose 180 feet above the marble floor, higher than any building in northern Europe, higher than most buildings anywhere on Earth. The dome appeared to float. This was an illusion created by the ring of windows at its base, which flooded the interior with light and made the dome itself seem weightless, suspended by the hand of God rather than supported by stone and mortar. The walls were covered in gold mosaic, 40 million tesserae of glass and gold leaf depicting Christ and the saints and the emperors who had built and rebuilt and embellished this monument across the centuries. Candles and oil lamps by the thousand filled the space with a warm, flickering radiance that made the gold seem to move, to breathe, to live. The liturgy was conducted in Greek, incomprehensible to a Norwegian, but performed with a grandeur that required no translation. Choirs of trained voices, clouds of incense, processions of priests in vestments that cost more than a prosperous Norse farm. We have a report, much later, of how such magnificence affected northerners encountering it for the first time. When the emissaries of Vladimir of Kiev, Harold's sister's father-in-law, visited Constantinople in 987 and attended services at the Hagia Sophia, they reported back to their prince, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we are at a loss how to describe it. We know only that God dwells there among men." Vladimir, the account continues, converted to Christianity largely on the strength of this report. The story may be apocryphal. It has the suspicious neatness of propaganda, designed to justify Vladimir's political choice in religious terms, but it captures something real about the Byzantine strategy of overwhelm, the deliberate use of magnificence as a tool of statecraft. Constantinople was not accidentally beautiful. It was deliberately, strategically, instrumentally beautiful. Every gilded icon, every soaring dome, every precisely choreographed ceremony was designed to communicate a message. This empire is richer than you, more powerful than you, more favored by God than you. Your only rational response is submission. Harold Sigurdsson was not a man inclined to submission, but he was intelligent enough to recognize power when he saw it, and shrewd enough to want a share of it, rather than to throw himself uselessly against its walls. The process by which a newly arrived Northman became a member of the Varangian Guard is not fully documented in the sources. We know it happened. Men arrived from Scandinavia and eventually appeared in Byzantine military records as sworn members of the emperor's household. But the precise mechanisms of recruitment, training, and induction remain obscure. What we can piece together suggests a system that was both bureaucratic and personal, requiring both formal procedures and informal connections. Harold had one crucial advantage. He arrived with men. 500 warriors, more or less, who had followed him from the Ruslands, men who had fought beside him and who looked to him as their leader. This was not a young man seeking employment. This was a military unit seeking a contract. The Byzantine Empire had a long history of hiring such units wholesale, incorporating barbarian warbands into the imperial military structure while preserving their internal hierarchies and loyalties. It was efficient. You got a functioning military organization, already trained and already cohesive, without the trouble of building one from scratch. The negotiations would have been conducted through intermediaries. The Byzantine court did not conduct business directly with barbarians, not even barbarians seeking employment. There were officials whose job it was to handle such matters, the logothete of the Drome, who oversaw foreign affairs, and various lesser functionaries who dealt with military recruitment. There were also, almost certainly, existing Varangians who vouched for new arrivals, testified to their character, guaranteed their reliability. The Guard was, among other things, a network, a web of connections linking the north to the Mediterranean. Men who had served and returned to Scandinavia would tell their younger kinsmen about the opportunities in Miklagard. Men who had served and stayed would welcome those kinsmen when they arrived, help them navigate the bureaucratic complexities, introduce them to the right officials. The terms of service, once negotiated, were formal and binding. A Varangian swore an oath directly to the emperor, not to the empire, not to the state, but to the person of the reigning autocrat. This was a deliberate choice. The emperor was not merely the head of government. He was, in Byzantine political theology, God's representative on earth, the link between the divine and the human, the living embodiment of Roman Christian civilization. To swear an oath to him was to participate in a sacred relationship, not merely a contractual one. The oath was administered in a ceremony that impressed upon the recruit the solemnity of his commitment. He swore to protect the emperor's life with his own, to obey the emperor's commands without question, to keep the emperor's secrets, to remain loyal until death or discharge. In return, the Varangian received a salary paid in gold. The exact amounts varied with rank and period, but the base pay appears to have been generous by the standards of the time. Enough to live comfortably in the capital, enough to save significant sums over the course of a career, enough to make the journey worthwhile. Beyond the salary, there were additional perquisites. Varangians were entitled to a share of the plunder taken in imperial military campaigns. They received gifts from the emperor on significant occasions, accession anniversaries, religious festivals, military victories. And they enjoyed, by ancient tradition, a remarkable privilege at the death of each emperor. This privilege was called the pillaging, an old Norse word that appears in the sagas and that scholars have debated for centuries. Its literal meaning is something like palace sweeping or palace pillaging, and it referred to the right of the Varangians to enter the imperial treasury after an emperor's death and take away as much treasure as they could carry. The custom sounds improbable. What state would permit its elite troops to loot the treasury at every succession? But it is attested in multiple sources, Byzantine and Scandinavian, and appears to have been genuinely practiced. The logic, perhaps, was that the Varangians' loyalty was to the person of the emperor, not to the office or the dynasty. When the emperor died, the oath died with him. The pillaging was a settlement of accounts, a final payment for services rendered, and a way of ensuring that the Varangians would not interfere in the succession. They got their silver. The new emperor got their renewed oaths. Everyone benefited. Harold would have understood this arrangement immediately. It was, in essence, a formalization of the relationship between a Norse chieftain and his warriors, translated into Byzantine terms. The chieftain fed his men, armed them, gave them gold and glory. In return, they fought for him and kept his secrets. The emperor was simply a chieftain on an incomprehensibly vast scale, with an incomprehensibly vast treasury and an incomprehensibly vast realm to protect. The underlying logic was the same. What the arrangement did not include was any guarantee of command. Harold arrived as a leader of 500 men, but his rank within the Byzantine military structure was something to be earned, not assumed. The empire had its own hierarchy, its own system of titles and positions, its own criteria for advancement. A barbarian prince meant nothing here. A half-brother of a northern king meant nothing. What mattered was what you did once you swore your oath. The decade that followed would answer the question of what Harald Sigurdsson could do. The Byzantine Empire of the 1030s and 1040s was not at peace. It was never at peace. The 1,000-year survival of the Roman state in its eastern form was not a passive achievement, not the result of favorable geography or good luck. It was the product of constant, expensive, exhausting military effort, fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who sought, century after century, to take what the empire had. To the east lay the greatest threat, the Islamic caliphates and their successor states, which had been pressing against Byzantine Anatolia since the 7th century. The Arab conquests had stripped the empire of Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and North Africa, provinces that had been Roman for nearly a millennium, that had supplied the grain and gold and manpower that made Mediterranean empire possible. What remained was a rump state reduced to Anatolia, the southern Balkans, and scattered possessions in Italy and the Aegean. For 3 centuries, the Byzantines had fought to hold this line, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but always fighting. By Harold's time, the immediate Arab threat had receded. The caliphate had fragmented. Its successor states were more concerned with fighting each other than with attacking Byzantium. The empire had even gone on the offensive, reconquering parts of Syria and pushing deep into Mesopotamia. But the eastern frontier remained volatile. Local emirs tested Byzantine defenses. Armenian kingdoms played Byzantine and Islamic powers against each other. The Caucasus seethed with tribal conflicts that periodically spilled over into imperial territory. To the north and west, other threats materialized. The Bulgars had been a persistent enemy for centuries, their kingdom pressing against Byzantine Macedonia and Thrace. In 1018, just 16 years before Harold's arrival, the Emperor Basil II had finally destroyed the Bulgarian state after decades of brutal warfare, earning himself the epithet the Bulgar Slayer, and blinding an entire army of Bulgarian prisoners, 15,000 men, it was said, divided into groups of 100, with one man in each group left with a single eye to lead the others home. The Bulgarian kingdom was annexed, but the population remained restive, resentful of Byzantine rule, ready to rebel when opportunity presented itself. In Italy, the empire clung to its southern possessions, Calabria, Apulia, parts of Sicily, but faced constant pressure from Lombard princes, Norman adventurers, and the reviving military power of the Western papacy. The Normans in particular were becoming a serious problem by the 1040s, carving out territories in southern Italy with the same combination of military prowess and political opportunism that had made their ancestors successful in Normandy, England, and the Rus lands. And always, everywhere, there were internal threats. Byzantine politics was not a gentle art. Emperors were deposed, blinded, murdered, exiled. Generals revolted. Provinces broke away. Factions at court maneuvered for advantage with a ruthlessness that would have impressed any Norse jarl. The Varangian Guard existed, in large part, precisely because the emperor could not trust his own subjects. He needed foreign bodyguards who had no stake in domestic politics, no ties to Byzantine factions, no reason to support a usurper over the legitimate ruler. The Varangians' foreignness was their qualification. Harold would fight on all of these fronts. The sources, Byzantine histories, the later Norse sagas, scattered references in other traditions, place him in campaigns across the length and breadth of the empire's military operations. He fought the Arabs in Anatolia and Mesopotamia. He fought pirates in the Aegean. He fought rebels in Bulgaria. He fought the Normans in Sicily. He fought, if the sources can be trusted, in 18 pitched battles over roughly 10 years of service, and he commanded forces in many of them. The details of individual campaigns are difficult to reconstruct. The Byzantine historians who mentioned Harold did so briefly, as one figure among many in the great machinery of imperial warfare. They were not interested in providing a biography of a barbarian mercenary, even a successful one. The Norse sagas, written 2 centuries later, were more interested in Harold, but less reliable on specifics, prone to exaggeration and anachronism and the conflation of different events into single dramatic narratives. What we can say with confidence is that Harold rose quickly. By the late 1030s, he appears to have held significant command authority within the Varangian Guard. By the early 1040s, he was operating at the level of imperial general, leading combined forces of Varangians and Byzantine regulars on independent campaigns. This was unusual. Most Varangians remained in the capital, guarding the palace, accompanying the emperor on ceremonial occasions, occasionally deploying as an elite unit within larger armies. For a Varangian to command major military operations was rare enough to be remarkable. His success had several sources. He was, by all accounts, a superb fighter in personal combat. Tall, strong, skilled with weapons, possessed of the controlled ferocity that Norse culture valued. But personal prowess was common among warriors who reached Constantinople. What distinguished Harold was something else, a capacity for strategic thinking, for understanding the larger shape of a military situation, for making decisions under pressure that consistently produced favorable outcomes. One episode, attested in both Byzantine and Scandinavian sources, suggests his style. During a siege, the sources do not agree on which siege, placing it variously in Sicily, Bulgaria, or the Arab lands, Harold found himself commanding a force that could not breach the enemy's walls by conventional assault. The fortifications were too strong, the defenders too numerous, the approaches too well covered. A conventional commander might have settled in for a long blockade, waiting for starvation to do what swords could not. Harold chose differently. He ordered his men to capture birds, sparrows, swallows, whatever nested in the eaves of buildings within the city. The birds were fitted with burning materials attached to their bodies and released. They flew back to their nests, carrying fire into the thatched roofs and wooden structures of the city. The resulting conflagration forced the defenders to abandon the walls and fight the fires, allowing Harold's forces to assault and take the city. The story may be legendary. It appears in various forms across medieval literature, attributed to different commanders in different times and places. But its attribution to Harold, in independent traditions, suggests that something like it may have happened, or at least that Harold developed a reputation for unorthodox thinking, for solving problems through cleverness rather than brute force. He also developed a reputation for something less admirable: ruthlessness. The same sources that praise his military genius note his willingness to use extreme measures. He blinded captives, he executed prisoners, he broke promises when breaking them served his purposes. These were not unusual behaviors by the standards of medieval warfare, Byzantine or Norse, but Harold appears to have practiced them with particular efficiency. He was not sadistic. The sources do not suggest he enjoyed cruelty for its own sake, but he was entirely willing to employ it as a tool. Men who surrendered to Harold Sigurdsson received fair treatment if fair treatment was useful. They received death if death was useful. The calculation was purely instrumental. This was, in a sense, the education that Constantinople provided. The empire had survived for 1,000 years, not through kindness, but through the careful, systematic, unsentimental application of power. Byzantine statecraft was legendary for its complexity, but beneath the complexity lay simple principles: reward your friends, punish your enemies, never let sentiment override advantage. Harold learned these lessons. He learned them so well that he would eventually apply them to the conquest of a kingdom. But that conquest lay in the future. In the early 1040s, Harold Sigurdsson was still a Varangian, still a servant of the Byzantine Emperor, still building the fortune and reputation that would fund his later ambitions. And in 1042, everything changed. The Empress Zoe was 54 years old, the daughter of Constantine VIII, the sister-in-law of Basil II, the Bulgar slayer. She had been married 3 times, widowed twice, and her current husband, Michael V, was an ungrateful schemer who had risen to the throne through her favor and now sought to discard her. In April of 1042, Michael made his move. He accused Zoe of attempting to poison him, a plausible charge given Byzantine history but almost certainly false, and had her arrested, tonsured, and exiled to a monastery on one of the Prince's Islands in the Sea of Marmara. It was a miscalculation of spectacular proportions. Michael had underestimated the Empress's popularity or overestimated his own. The people of Constantinople rose in riot. The Patriarch refused to recognize the deposition. The army wavered, and the Varangian Guard, whose oath was to the legitimate ruler, found itself facing a choice. The choice, when it came, was less ambiguous than later romanticizers would prefer. The Varangians were oath-bound, yes, but they were also professionals, men who had survived in Byzantine service precisely because they understood how power actually worked in Constantinople. And in April of 1042, power was hemorrhaging away from Michael V with every passing hour. The sequence of events moved with the terrifying speed that Byzantine palace revolutions often achieved. Michael had seized the throne through Zoe. He had legitimacy only through her. By removing her, he had removed the foundation of his own authority and left himself standing on nothing but the loyalty of men who had no particular reason to be loyal. The city mob that gathered outside the palace was not a spontaneous expression of popular outrage, though genuine outrage existed, but a coordinated action by aristocratic factions that saw an opportunity to reset the board. The Patriarch's refusal to bless the deposition gave the rebellion ecclesiastical cover. The wavering of the regular army units gave it military possibility. What remained was the question of the Varangians. They chose Zoe. The sources are not entirely clear on whether this was a collective decision by the Guard, an order from commanding officers who had calculated the odds, or a more spontaneous defection when the direction of events became obvious. What is clear is that the Varangians did not defend Michael V. When the mob broke into the palace, or was admitted by guards who had decided which side they were on, the Northmen, who should have formed the emperor's last line of defense, were notably absent from that line. Michael fled to a monastery, seeking sanctuary. It did not save him. He was dragged out, and in the Byzantine tradition reserved for deposed emperors, he was blinded. The hot iron that took his sight was, in a sense, the empire's way of retiring him from political life without the theological complications of execution. He would live out his days in darkness, no longer a threat to anyone. Zoe was restored. She would rule jointly with her sister Theodora, and shortly thereafter marry for a fourth time to a nobleman named Constantine Monomachos, who became Constantine IX. The Varangian Guard's position was, if anything, strengthened by these events. They had chosen correctly. They had demonstrated that their loyalty was to the legitimate succession rather than to any particular occupant of the throne, which made them more valuable as guardians precisely because their allegiance was principled rather than personal. An emperor could trust Varangians to defend him because Varangians would defend whoever legitimately held the office, which meant that as long as an emperor remained legitimate, the guard was absolutely reliable. Harald Sigurdsson, however, was about to test the limits of that reliability. The sources disagree violently on what happened next. The Byzantine chroniclers, writing from the imperial perspective, suggest that Harald had been skimming from the emperor's treasury, that he had appropriated booty that should have gone to the crown, that he had committed serious financial crimes during his years of profitable service. The saga writers, telling the story from the Norse perspective, suggest that Harald had simply accumulated legitimate wealth through his share of plunder and imperial payments, and the Byzantine authorities now sought to confiscate it through false accusations. Both versions agree on the essential facts. Harald had become extremely wealthy, the imperial government wanted that wealth, and Harald had no intention of surrendering it. What followed was either an escape or a prison break, depending on which sources you trust. Harald was either arrested and imprisoned, or he anticipated arrest and moved first. Either way, he found himself in conflict with the very authorities he had served for nearly a decade. The saga tradition describes an elaborate escape involving a ship, loyal followers, and a dramatic flight across the Bosphorus. The Byzantine sources are terser, noting simply that Harald departed imperial service under less than honorable circumstances. There is another story, darker and stranger, that appears in some versions. It suggests that during the chaos of Michael V's deposition, Harald personally participated in the emperor's blinding, that he was one of the men who held Michael down while the iron was heated, or even that he was the one who applied it. This may be literary embellishment, connecting the famous Varangian to the famous atrocity for dramatic effect. Or it may be true. Harald's later career would demonstrate no squeamishness about such measures, and if he did participate, it would explain why his departure from Constantinople was so abrupt and so conflicted. An emperor who had helped blind the previous emperor might reasonably fear that his successors would regard him as a dangerous precedent. What is certain is that by 1043 or 1044, Harald Sigurdsson was no longer in Constantinople. He had served the Byzantine Empire for approximately a decade. He had fought across 3 continents. He had accumulated a fortune in gold that the saga writers would estimate, with their usual imprecision, at enough to fund the conquest of a kingdom. He had learned siege warfare, naval tactics, palace politics, and the application of systematic ruthlessness to military and political problems. He had arrived as a refugee prince without a throne. He was leaving as one of the most experienced military commanders in Northern Europe. He went home. The journey north took him through the Rus's lands, through Kiev, where he collected a bride, Elizabeth, the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, the same Yaroslav whose service he had left a decade earlier. The marriage was political, connecting Harald to one of the most powerful ruling families in Eastern Europe, but the sources suggest there was genuine affection as well. Elizabeth would bear him daughters and accompany him through the wars to come. She would also wait and wait and wait through years of campaigning that would take her husband farther and farther from anything resembling peace. From Kiev, Harald traveled to Scandinavia, arriving in Sweden around 1045. He found the political landscape transformed from the chaos of his youth. His half-brother Olaf was dead and canonized, a saint of the church whose cult was spreading across Norway. His nephew Magnus, Olaf's illegitimate son, had become king of Norway, and by an accident of dynastic politics, king of Denmark as well, having inherited the Danish throne from Harthacnut, who had died without heirs. Magnus the Good, as he was called, ruled both kingdoms, and Harald Sigurdsson, returning with Byzantine gold and a reputation that preceded him, intended to rule at least one of them. What happened next was negotiation, backed by the implicit threat of war. Harald had money, men, and military expertise. Magnus had legitimacy, an established government, and the advantage of possession. They reached an agreement. Harald would become co-ruler of Norway, sharing the throne with his nephew. It was an arrangement that satisfied neither party and could not possibly last. When Magnus died in 1047, Harald became sole king of Norway. He was 32 years old. Everything before had been preparation. Now the main work began. The Norway that Harald Sigurdsson inherited was not the Norway of today's mental maps, a clearly defined nation-state with recognized borders and settled institutions. It was a collection of regions, farming communities, coastal settlements, and mountain valleys that had been unified politically only within living memory. The kingship itself was contested, not in the sense that anyone currently challenged Harald's claim, but in the deeper sense that the very nature of royal authority remained undefined. Norwegian kings ruled through a combination of personal loyalty, military dominance, and negotiated agreements with local magnates. The system required constant maintenance. A king who could not command loyalty, enforce his will, and buy support when loyalty and enforcement failed would not remain king for long. Harald proved exceptionally capable at all three. His reign would last nearly 20 years, and the sources remember him primarily for two things: his failed attempt to conquer Denmark and his successful transformation of Norway into something closer to a European-style kingdom. The Danish wars dragged on for most of his reign. Campaigns, raids, burned towns, naval battles, destroyed fleets, without producing a decisive result. Harald won victories, but could not translate them into permanent conquest. The Danes lost battles but refused to submit. The conflict became a bleeding wound that consumed resources, killed men, and achieved nothing. It may have been unwinnable from the start. It was certainly unresolved at the end. The internal transformation is more interesting and more relevant to understanding what the Varangian experience meant. Harald applied Byzantine methods to Norwegian problems. He strengthened royal control over the coinage. He built churches and patronized the church hierarchy, understanding that ecclesiastical organization could reinforce royal authority. He dealt with local magnates who challenged his power through methods that combined negotiation, intimidation, and occasional execution. He was, in short, building a state. The nickname that history would give him, Hardrada, hard ruler, captures something true about his methods but misses something important about their source. His hardness was not brutish or arbitrary. It was systematic. It was learned. It was Byzantine. The man who had watched emperors rise and fall in Constantinople, who had seen how institutions could outlast individuals, and how power could be preserved through careful administration rather than constant warfare, brought that education to the relatively primitive political environment of medieval Norway. He was trying to build something that could survive him. It would not survive the manner of his ending. By 1066, Harald Sigurdsson was 51 years old, had been king of Norway for nearly 2 decades, and had accomplished much of what he set out to do. The Danish wars were effectively over, not won but abandoned, as both sides exhausted themselves. Norway was more unified, more prosperous, more clearly organized under royal authority than it had been when he took the throne. He had wealth, an army, a fleet, and a reputation that extended across the known world. He also had one more war in him. The opportunity came from England. Edward the Confessor, King of the English, died in January 1066 without a clear heir. Multiple claimants emerged. Harold Godwinson, the powerful English earl who had himself crowned the day after Edward's death. William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed that Edward had promised him the throne, and Harald Sigurdsson of Norway, whose claim rested on an older promise supposedly made by an earlier Danish king. The historical validity of Harold's claim matters less than the fact that he believed it sufficient to justify invasion. He may have believed it genuinely. He may have simply wanted England, and the claim provided convenient justification. The distinction, at this distance, is impossible to recover. In September 1066, Harold sailed for England with a fleet that the sources estimated several hundred ships and an army of perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 men. It was the last great Viking invasion of the British Isles, though no one knew that at the time. Harold landed in the north of England, on the Yorkshire coast, and moved inland. He met and defeated an English force at the Battle of Fulford Gate on September 20th, scattering the northern English earls and opening the way to York. The city submitted. Harold set up camp at Stamford Bridge on the River Derwent to await hostages and supplies from the surrounding countryside. What he did not expect, what no one expected, was Harold Godwinson. The English king had been in the south, watching the coast for William of Normandy's expected invasion. When word reached him of the Norwegian landing, Harold marched his army north at a pace that seemed impossible. He covered nearly 200 miles in 4 or 5 days, arriving at Stamford Bridge on September 25th with an army that should have been exhausted, but was instead primed for battle. The Norwegians were caught off guard. Many of them had left their armor on the ships, not expecting a fight. Harald Sigurdsson, the man who had campaigned across half the Byzantine Empire, who had learned every lesson Constantinople could teach about the application of military force, had been surprised in camp by an enemy he had not even known was coming. The battle that followed was desperate, bloody, and decisive. The English assault caught the Norwegians on both sides of the river, with the main body scrambling to form a line while a smaller force held the bridge. The saga traditions remember a single Norwegian giant holding the bridge alone against the entire English army, killing man after man until an Englishman floated under the bridge in a barrel and speared him from below. The story may be legend. The basic tactical picture is not. The Norwegians were disorganized, surprised, and facing an enemy that had every advantage of momentum and morale. Harald Sigurdsson died on the field. An arrow struck him in the throat early in the battle, before the fighting was fully joined. The great career, the decades of preparation, the Byzantine education, the Norwegian kingship, the ambition that had driven him from a hiding place at 15 to the shores of England at 51. All of it ended with a single point of iron entering his neck. He fell. The Norwegians fought on for hours until the reinforcements from the ships arrived with their armor and joined the slaughter. But the outcome was never in doubt after Harold went down. The English annihilated the invasion. Of the several hundred ships that had brought the Norwegian army to England, the saga tradition claims that fewer than 30 were needed to carry the survivors home. Harold Godwinson had saved England from the Vikings. 19 days later, William of Normandy landed in the south, and 3 weeks after that, Harold himself was dead at Hastings, shot through the eye if the traditions are true. England fell to the Normans, the descendants of Rollo, themselves originally Norse, who had transformed into something else entirely during their century and a half in France. The Viking Age, which had begun with Lindisfarne in 793 and which had reached its strangest flowering in the Varangian Guard of Constantinople, ended at Stamford Bridge in 1066. It did not end quietly. Harald Sigurdsson's story is the most dramatic individual narrative to emerge from the Varangian experience, but it is not representative. Most Varangians did not become kings. Most did not return home to conquer realms. Most served their years, accumulated their pay, and either died in Byzantine service or retired to whatever places would have them. The Guard outlasted Harold by centuries. It outlasted the dynasty that had employed him. It outlasted, in various forms, the empire itself. But his story illuminates something essential about what the Varangian institution meant and what it did to the men who passed through it. Harold arrived as a Norse warrior, brave, skilled, but fundamentally a product of the raiding culture that had terrorized Europe for 2 centuries. He departed as something different, a commander who had absorbed the operational sophistication of the most advanced military organization in the Christian world, a politician who understood palace intrigue at its most lethal, an administrator who could envision state building on a scale that Scandinavian kings had never attempted. The transformation was not complete. He died making a Viking raid, after all, lunging for a kingdom he could not hold. But it was real, and he was only one man. Through the Varangian Guard, across 3 centuries, thousands of Northmen made that same journey. They traveled from the cold margins of the world to its glittering center. They learned what civilization looked like when it had 1,000 years to refine itself. They took what they learned and carried it back into the courts and churches and counting houses of Scandinavia and the Russlands and everywhere else the Norse diaspora touched. The Guard was a school. The curriculum was empire. The institution continued after Harold's death, recruiting new generations of Northmen, even as Scandinavia itself transformed into recognizably Christian kingdoms. The saga traditions sent new heroes south, men whose names survive in Icelandic manuscripts, whose adventures may have been real or legendary, or some shifting combination of both. The Guard continued to serve, continued to fight, continued to provide the Byzantine emperors with warriors whose foreignness was their credential and whose oath was their identity. But the world was changing around them. The world was changing around them, and in ways that would ultimately determine not just the fate of the Varangian Guard, but the fate of the empire it served. The decades following Harold Sigurdsson's death saw Constantinople at something close to its medieval zenith. The city remained the largest and wealthiest in Christendom, its population somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 souls, depending on which estimate you trust. Its harbors crowded with the commerce of 3 continents, its treasury still capable of financing armies and bribing enemies and maintaining the elaborate machinery of imperial governance that had survived for 7 centuries. The emperors who followed Constantine Monamakos, the man Harold had served and despised, continued the rhythms of Byzantine rule. Border wars, palace conspiracies, theological disputes, the endless management of an empire that stretched from the Adriatic to the Euphrates. The Varangian Guard served through all of it. The axe-bearing Northmen remained at their posts in the Bucolion Palace, their presence so constant that Byzantine chroniclers often mention them only in passing, the way one might mention the walls or the gates. They were part of the architecture of imperial power. But the composition of the Guard was beginning to shift. The old recruiting grounds were drying up. Scandinavia in the late 11th century was no longer the warrior-exporting society it had been 100 years earlier. The kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had solidified into recognizable Christian monarchies with their own armies, their own administrative structures, their own demands on the martial energy of their populations. The great wave of Norse migration that had sent Varangians to Constantinople was subsiding. Young Norwegian warriors who might once have sought fortune in the East increasingly found opportunities closer to home, in the household troops of their own kings, in the emerging aristocratic structures of the new Nordic kingdoms, in the crusading ventures that would soon redirect European martial energy toward the Holy Land. The Rose contribution continued longer. The trade routes that had carried Swedish Varangians south for generations remained open, and the Kievan state continued to produce warriors willing to make the journey to Constantinople. But even the Russlands were transforming. The conversion to Christianity under Vladimir had been followed by generations of cultural development that made the Rus princes increasingly similar to their European counterparts. The old Viking-era connection between Scandinavia and the eastern settlements was weakening. The Rus were becoming Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, peoples with their own trajectories, their own identities, their own reasons to keep their warriors at home. And so the Varangian Guard adapted, as Byzantine institutions had always adapted. Beginning in the years after the Norman conquest of England, a new wave of recruits began arriving at Constantinople's harbors. They came not from the fjords of Norway or the forests of Sweden, but from a conquered island off the coast of France. They were Anglo-Saxons, the descendants of the same Germanic peoples who had fought against the Vikings for 3 centuries, now displaced by a conquest they could not accept. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in October 1066, the same campaign season that saw Harold Sigurdsson's death at Stamford Bridge, fundamentally restructured English society. The Norman lords who followed William received grants of land across the kingdom, displacing the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy that had held those estates for generations. The process was not instantaneous, but it was systematic. By the time of the Domesday Book in 1086, 20 years after the conquest, the dispossession was essentially complete. The great Anglo-Saxon families had been stripped of their lands, their titles, their positions at court. They faced a choice: submit to Norman rule and accept whatever diminished status the new regime would allow, or leave. Some chose to leave. The Byzantine sources, corroborated by later English traditions, record waves of Anglo-Saxon refugees arriving in Constantinople in the decades after the conquest. They came seeking exactly what the Norse Varangians had sought before them: service, pay, and the dignity of meaningful work in a civilization that valued their skills. The Byzantine emperors, facing the depletion of their traditional Scandinavian recruiting base, welcomed them. The Guard needed bodies. These were trained warriors, many of them from families with generations of military experience fighting against, as it happened, the very Vikings whose descendants the Guard had previously employed. The irony would have been delicious if anyone had paused to notice it. Men whose grandfathers had died defending English monasteries from Norse raiders now served alongside the grandsons of those raiders, all of them sworn to the same Byzantine emperor, all of them carrying the same axes, all of them bound by the same oath. The Guard had always been a composite force, a mercenary formation defined by professional loyalty rather than ethnic solidarity. But this new composition represented something more dramatic than previous shifts. It represented the end of the specifically Norse character that had defined the institution for 2.5 centuries. The Anglo-Saxons brought their own traditions, their own language, their own grievances. Some Byzantine sources suggest that the new recruits maintained a certain separateness within the Guard, forming their own communities, perhaps their own subunits. The shared identity of having been dispossessed, of being exiles from a conquered homeland, gave the Anglo-Saxon Varangians a cohesion that transcended the individual recruitment patterns that had characterized the Norse period. They were not simply adventurers seeking fortune. They were refugees, men without a country, and Constantinople became their country. Byzantine writers of the 12th century often referred to the Varangians as English rather than Norse, using terminology that would have made no sense to chroniclers of the previous century. The shift in nomenclature reflects a real demographic transformation. By the time of the First Crusade, which reached Constantinople in 1096, 3 decades after Hastings, the Guard's composition had changed decisively. The typical Varangian of the 12th century was more likely to have grown up speaking Old English than Old Norse, more likely to have memories of Sussex or Yorkshire than of Trondheim or Uppsala. The institutional continuity, however, was remarkable. The Guard kept its name, it kept its ceremonial role, it kept its axes and its reputation for incorruptibility, and its privileged position within the Byzantine military hierarchy. The transition from Norse to Anglo-Saxon happened gradually enough that the institution itself never broke. New recruits learned the existing procedures, absorbed the existing traditions, stepped into roles that their Scandinavian predecessors had defined. The Guard was not its membership. It was its function, and that function became increasingly critical as the Byzantine Empire entered the most challenging period of its long existence. The trouble came from multiple directions simultaneously in the manner of genuine catastrophes. The Seljuk Turks, who had been pressing against Byzantine territory in Anatolia for decades, achieved a decisive breakthrough in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert. The Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led one of the largest Byzantine armies assembled in generations into the Armenian highlands to confront the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan. The battle went badly. The emperor was captured, an unprecedented humiliation, and the Byzantine army was shattered. More importantly, the defeat opened Anatolia to Turkish migration and settlement on a scale that would eventually transform the peninsula's demographic character entirely. The Varangian Guard was present at Manzikert. The sources are fragmentary, but they suggest that Varangians formed part of the emperor's personal escort during the battle, and may have been among the last troops defending him when he fell into enemy hands. Their presence at that disaster is fitting. The Guard had always been there at the critical moments, the pivot points where Byzantine history turned. They had been there for Basil II's victories. Now they were there for Romanos IV's catastrophe. The aftermath of Manzikert reshaped everything. The empire that had commanded the eastern Mediterranean for centuries suddenly found itself fighting for survival. The Anatolian plateau, which had provided much of Byzantium's agricultural surplus, its tax revenue, and its military manpower, fragmented into a patchwork of Turkish emirates and diminished Byzantine enclaves. Constantinople remained wealthy, remained populous, remained the spiritual and administrative center of the Orthodox world, but its hinterland was shrinking. The political chaos that followed Manzikert saw a rapid succession of emperors and usurpers, each struggling to stabilize a situation that defied stabilization. The Guard served through these transitions with its characteristic loyalty to whoever currently occupied the throne, its characteristic willingness to enforce whatever purge the current regime required. The Anglo-Saxon influx continued during this period, refugees from Norman England finding their way to an empire that was itself increasingly embattled. The connection between these two processes, the displacement of the Anglo-Saxons by the Normans and the crisis of Byzantium, became explicit during the reign of Alexios III Komnenos, who seized power in 1081 and would rule for 37 years. Alexios inherited a disaster and spent his reign managing it, clawing back fragments of what had been lost, defending what remained, playing diplomatic games with enemies he could no longer simply defeat. The Varangian Guard served him loyally, and the sources suggest that Alexios in turn trusted them absolutely, perhaps more than he trusted the Byzantine aristocratic families whose intrigues he had navigated his entire life. The First Crusade arrived during Alexios's reign, and with it came the Normans of southern Italy, the same Norman people who had conquered England, the same Norman people whose relatives had dispossessed the Anglo-Saxon families now serving in the Varangian Guard. The encounter must have been electric. When the Crusader armies gathered outside Constantinople in 1096 and 1097, waiting for Byzantine arrangements to ferry them across the Bosporus to confront the Turks, Varangian guardsmen would have found themselves face to face with representatives of the very regime that had destroyed their homeland. The Byzantine sources do not record any particular incidents, any confrontations between Anglo-Saxon Varangians and Norman Crusaders. Perhaps the discipline of the Guard held. Perhaps the decades of service had blurred the old hatreds. Perhaps the pragmatic necessities of the moment, the need to manage these dangerous crusading armies, to extract from them whatever utility the empire could gain while minimizing the damage they might cause, overrode any personal grievances the guardsmen might have nursed. But the potential was there. The past does not dissolve simply because circumstances change. Alexios himself seemed to recognize the value of the Anglo-Saxon contingent. Some later traditions suggest that he granted lands to Anglo-Saxon settlers along the Black Sea coast, creating communities of displaced English warriors and their families who would serve as frontier guards and agricultural colonists in territories the empire was struggling to hold. The evidence for these settlements is disputed. Some of it comes from sources written centuries later, some of it involves geographical confusion and evident embellishment, but the basic pattern is plausible. Byzantium had always been willing to settle foreign peoples on its frontiers in exchange for military service. The Anglo-Saxons would not have been the first refugee population to receive this treatment, nor the last. The Guard continued through the 12th century, serving the Komnenian emperors who followed Alexios, his son John II, a capable soldier who spent most of his reign on campaign, recovering Anatolian territory. His grandson Manuel Thurfburn, an emperor of extraordinary ambition who engaged in foreign policy adventures from Hungary to Egypt, who fought the Normans and the Turks and the Crusader states with varying success, who represented perhaps the last genuine attempt to restore Byzantine imperial greatness on the scale it had known before Manzikert. Manuel employed the Varangians extensively. He seems to have trusted them both as palace guards and as field troops, deploying them in his numerous campaigns across the empire's shrinking but still substantial territories. The Guard during his reign was a thoroughly professional force, its Scandinavian origins now largely historical, its Anglo-Saxon character dominant but increasingly diluted by recruits from other sources, other displaced peoples, other adventurers, anyone willing to take the oath and carry the axe. The composite nature of the late Varangian Guard reflects something essential about Byzantine civilization itself. The empire had always absorbed and transformed foreign peoples, making Romans out of Goths and Slavs and Armenians and Normans and anyone else who was willing to submit to the system. The Guard was this process in miniature, an institution that had been Norse, then Anglo-Saxon, then something harder to define, a mixed force of professional warriors whose shared identity came not from their blood or their language, but from their service, their oath, their axes, their privileged position at the heart of an ancient state. But states, even ancient ones, do not last forever. The catastrophe that ended Byzantine greatness came not from the Turks, not from the Normans, not from any of the traditional enemies the empire had been fighting for centuries. It came from fellow Christians, from the Fourth Crusade, from an army of French and Venetian crusaders who had set out to attack Egypt and somehow found themselves besieging Constantinople instead. The motivations are complex and disputed. The Crusaders owed money to Venice for their transport. The Venetians had commercial grievances against Constantinople. A Byzantine pretender named Alexios Angelos promised vast sums to the Crusaders if they would help him seize the throne from his uncle. The army that should have been fighting Saracens in the Nile Delta diverted instead to the Bosporus, where the greatest Christian city in the world awaited them. The first attack came in 1203. The Crusaders initially sought only to install their pretender and collect their payment. The Varangian Guard, still manning the walls in the palace, faced the strange and terrible situation of defending a Byzantine emperor against an army of Latin Christians. The sources suggest that the Varangians fought with their characteristic ferocity during the initial assaults, holding sections of wall that other defenders abandoned, maintaining discipline when panic spread through the Byzantine forces. The defense ultimately failed, not through any fault of the Guard, but through the broader collapse of Byzantine military and political coherence. The pretender, Alexios, was installed. The Crusaders waited for their payment. The payment failed to materialize. The Byzantine populace, outraged at the presence of Latin troops in their city, turned against the pretender they had never wanted. A palace revolution overthrew him. The Crusaders, their money still unpaid, their patience exhausted, decided to take what they were owed by force. The sack of Constantinople in April 1204 was one of the great atrocities of medieval history. For 3 days, the crusading army, men who had taken the cross, who wore Christ's symbol on their shoulders, pillaged the richest city in the Christian world. They stripped the churches of their treasures. They violated the convents. They melted down artifacts that had survived for 1,000 years. They destroyed libraries. They committed acts of desecration that shocked even contemporaries hardened to medieval violence. Where was the Varangian Guard during those 3 days? The sources are frustratingly incomplete. Some accounts suggest that Varangians defended the palace to the last, dying at their posts as the city burned around them. Others indicate that the Guard, seeing the situation was hopeless, negotiated terms with the Crusaders, perhaps the only Byzantine force professional enough and valuable enough to secure such terms. Some guardsmen may have escaped the city entirely, making their way to the various Byzantine successor states that would emerge from the wreckage. What seems clear is that the sack of 1204 effectively ended the Varangian Guard as a coherent institution. The Byzantine Empire itself shattered into fragments, the Empire of Nicaea in Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus in Greece, the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea. Constantinople itself became the capital of a Latin empire ruled by Crusader lords, its palaces occupied by foreigners who had no use for a Byzantine imperial guard. The axe-bearing Northmen had guarded Byzantine emperors for 3.5 centuries. Now, there were no Byzantine emperors in Constantinople to guard. The city would eventually be recovered. In 1261, the Nicaean Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos retook Constantinople almost without a fight, the Latin garrison having dwindled to insignificance over the preceding decades. The empire was restored, but as a shadow of what it had been. The territories were smaller, the treasury was depleted. The administrative and military infrastructure that had made Byzantium formidable was damaged beyond full repair. There are references to Varangians in the sources from this restored Byzantine Empire, guards and guardsmen serving the Palaiologan emperors through the 13th and 14th centuries. But these were not the Varangians of the Great Era. The recruitment networks that had fed the Guard for centuries, first from Scandinavia, then from post-conquest England, had long since dried up. The institution that continued under the old name was something diminished, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps simply a handful of foreigners in imperial service who inherited a prestigious title from a grander past. The final centuries of Byzantine history, the long, slow decline from 1261 to the Ottoman conquest in 1453, saw the empire shrink to a city-state, then barely that. The last Byzantine emperors ruled a city whose population had fallen from 500,000 to perhaps 50,000, whose walls enclosed gardens and ruins where neighborhoods had once stood, whose treasures had been sold or stolen or melted down to pay debts that could never be paid. If Varangians still served in those final years, they would have been guarding ghosts. The Guard, in its meaningful form, died with the empire it served. But what it represented, what those centuries of service had meant, outlasted both the institution and the state. The Varangian Guard was a school, and its curriculum was empire. The men who passed through it, whether they died in Byzantine service or returned to their homelands, carried with them knowledge that could not have been acquired anywhere else in the medieval world. They learned how a sophisticated bureaucratic state functioned. They learned how professional soldiers were trained and organized and paid and commanded. They learned how cities worked, not the wooden towns of Scandinavia, but genuine metropolises with aqueducts and sewers and fire brigades and markets that fed hundreds of thousands. They learned what an ancient civilization looked like when it had a millennium to refine its institutions. Some of this knowledge they brought home. Harold Sigurdsson is the most famous example, but there were thousands of others, men whose names survive only in fragmentary references, men whose names do not survive at all, who returned to Norway or Sweden or the Russ's lands or eventually to England, and brought with them ideas about how states should function, how warriors should comport themselves, how power should be organized and displayed. The Christianization of Scandinavia, the development of more sophisticated Nordic monarchies, the cultural transformation that ended the Viking Age, all of this was fed by the experience of men who had seen Constantinople and served its emperors and carried that experience back into the cold north. The Anglo-Saxons who joined the Guard in the post-conquest generations brought their own contribution. Some of them, presumably, never returned to England at all. They made their lives in Byzantine service, married Byzantine or other foreign women, raised children who were neither English nor Norse but something new, some variant of Mediterranean hybrid. Others returned eventually to an England that had transformed in their absence, where Norman French had merged with Old English to produce something that would eventually become the language in which these words are written. What they carried home from Constantinople is impossible to trace, but the carrying happened. The Guard was always more than a military unit. It was a vector of transmission, a channel through which knowledge and experience and cultural influence flowed between worlds that would otherwise have had little contact. The Norse world and the Byzantine world were not natural partners. They were connected by geography, the river routes that ran from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and by opportunity, the chance for young men seeking fortune to find it in the richest city they could reach. The Guard institutionalized that connection, gave it form and permanence, made it something more than random adventuring. The result was one of the strangest cultural exchanges of the medieval world. For 3 centuries, give or take, the most feared warriors of the northern seas stood watch over the most sophisticated civilization in Christendom. Men whose grandfathers had burned Lindisfarne now protected the relics of saints in the churches of Constantinople. Men whose fathers had worshipped Odin knelt in the Hagia Sophia and received communion from the patriarch. The transformation was not merely occupational, it was civilizational. Consider what it meant for a young man from a Norwegian fjord or a Swedish river valley to arrive in Constantinople for the first time. He would have traveled for weeks, perhaps months, down the Dnieper if he came from the Rus lands, across the Mediterranean if he came by sea, overland through Bulgaria if he took the most direct route from the north. He would have passed through lands progressively stranger, progressively more populated, progressively more cultivated. And then he would have seen the walls. The Theodosian walls stretched for nearly 4 miles across the peninsula that held the city, a triple line of fortification that had stood for 7 centuries by the time the Guard reached its peak. The outer wall rose 15 feet. Behind it, a wider space than the inner wall, 40 feet high, punctuated by towers that rose higher still. Behind that, a moat, dry or flooded depending on the season and the state of maintenance. No fortification in northern Europe came close. The largest wooden palisades the young Norseman would have seen in his homeland would have seemed like children's toys beside this stonework. And the walls were only the beginning. Beyond them lay a city that contained more people than lived in all of Norway, markets that sold goods from India and China, from Africa and Spain, from everywhere the trade routes reached, churches whose domes seemed to float on light, palaces whose corridors extended for miles, a hippodrome that could seat 100,000 spectators, aqueducts that carried water from mountains 50 miles distant, public baths, street lighting, a functioning sewage system, a fire brigade, a postal service, a diplomatic corps, a navy, a standing army, schools of philosophy, libraries containing the accumulated knowledge of the Greek and Roman worlds. The Norsemen had come from a society where literacy was rare, where kings ruled through personal charisma and the loyalty of their sworn warriors, where the largest structures were wooden halls that a determined enemy could burn in an afternoon. He had arrived in a place where emperors commanded through written orders, where bureaucrats filed reports in triplicate, where the accumulated institutional knowledge of 1,000 years guided every decision from tax collection to military deployment to the protocol of court ceremonies. The shock must have been profound. It must also, for many of them, have been exhilarating, because the young men who joined the Varangian Guard were not fools. They were, by and large, the ambitious ones, the capable ones, the ones who had heard stories about Byzantine gold and decided to seek it rather than accept the limited prospects of their home villages. They were the kind of men who noticed things, who learned quickly, who adapted. And Constantinople was the greatest school available to them. They learned languages first. Greek, obviously, the language of command, of negotiation, of the markets and the churches and the courts. Many of them also learned at least some Arabic, given the empire's constant dealings with its Muslim neighbors. Some learned Slavic languages, Armenian, Georgian, the various tongues of the cosmopolitan capital. The Guard functioned as a multilingual unit by necessity, its members communicating in whatever mixture of Norse and Greek and Pidgin served the immediate need. They learned military technique. The Byzantine army did not fight like Scandinavian war bands. It fought as a disciplined force, with specialized units, with coordinated tactics, with a logistical system that could supply large armies for extended campaigns. The Varangians brought their individual ferocity to this system, but they also absorbed its organizational principles. They learned what it meant to be part of a military machine rather than a collection of individual warriors. Some of them, the clever ones, learned to command such machines themselves. They learned court protocol, that elaborate choreography of bowing and titles and precedents that governed every interaction in the Byzantine palace. They learned who outranked whom, which doors to enter by, which phrases to use when addressing which officials. They learned to navigate a social hierarchy far more complex than anything that existed in the North, where status was determined by birth and deed and personal force, rather than by precise position in an elaborate bureaucratic table of ranks. They learned religion. The Byzantine Christianity they encountered was not the Christianity of the Irish monks whose monasteries their ancestors had raided. It was a state religion integrated into every aspect of imperial governance, presided over by a patriarch who ranked second only to the emperor in the official hierarchy. practiced in churches whose splendor was meant to convey divine truth through overwhelming beauty. The Varangians, who arrived as pagans, and some still did in the early centuries, found themselves immersed in a religious culture that demanded conversion and rewarded it. The Varangians, who arrived as Christians from newly converted Scandinavia, found their faith deepened and complicated by contact with its ancient Mediterranean forms. They learned finance. Byzantine coinage was the most trusted currency in the medieval world. The gold solidus, the bezant as Western merchants called it, had maintained its purity for 7 centuries, an anchor of economic stability in a world of debased and fluctuating local currencies. The Varangians were paid in this coin. They learned its value relative to other currencies. They learned how to save it, how to invest it, how to send it home. Some of them became wealthy by any standard of their age. The gold they brought back to Scandinavia seeded economic transformations in their homelands, introducing monetized exchange to societies that had previously operated largely on barter and gift-giving. They learned, perhaps most importantly, what was possible. They learned that cities could contain hundreds of thousands of people and function. They learned that governments could persist across generations, transmitting authority through institutions rather than merely through bloodlines. They learned that written law could regulate behavior more consistently than custom and the judgment of chieftains. They learned that professional administration could accomplish things that personal rule could not. This knowledge was dangerous. It was the kind of knowledge that, once acquired, made the old ways seem provincial, primitive, insufficient. The men who returned from Constantinople to Scandinavia returned with eyes that saw their homelands differently. The wooden halls seemed small, the petty kingdoms seemed fragmented and weak. The endemic warfare between neighboring lords seemed wasteful, pointless, a failure of organization rather than an inevitable feature of human society. Some of these men became agents of change. They brought home ideas about kingship that emphasized centralized authority, written law, professional administration. They brought home ideas about religion that favored the organized church over local variation. They brought home ideas about warfare that valued discipline over individual heroics. They did not transform Scandinavia overnight. No individual or group of individuals could have done that, but they contributed to the gradual transformation that ended the Viking Age and produced the medieval Nordic kingdoms. The specific mechanisms of this transmission are largely invisible to us. The sources do not say, and then Thorstein returned from Constantinople and persuaded King Olaf to adopt Byzantine administrative practices. What they show instead is a gradual convergence, a slow movement of Scandinavian societies toward models that resembled, in simplified form, what the Varangians had seen. Written law codes, professional royal retinues, monetary taxation, organized churches with hierarchical authority. None of these developments required Byzantine influence to explain. Similar developments occurred throughout medieval Europe, but the Varangian connection was surely one of the channels through which such ideas flowed. The reverse transmission, Byzantine absorption of Norse cultural elements, was more limited but not absent. The Varangians brought their own traditions into their service, their feasting customs, their loyalty oaths, their particular styles of combat. Byzantine sources occasionally note these foreign peculiarities with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. The Guard celebrated its own festivals, maintained its own internal customs, operated in some ways as a Norse enclave within the cosmopolitan capital. But the larger flow was unmistakably from Constantinople to the north. The Byzantines had little to learn from Scandinavian society except how to employ its warriors. The Scandinavians had everything to learn from Byzantium, and the Varangians were positioned to learn it. Not all of them did, of course. Some remained stubbornly themselves, collecting their pay and spending it on drink and women, caring nothing for the civilization around them, beyond its capacity to provide entertainment and employment. Some died young in the battles that were the Guard's reason for existence before they had time to absorb much of anything. Some went native so completely that they never returned home at all, disappearing into the Mediterranean world and leaving no trace in the Scandinavian sources. The proportion who actually served as cultural transmitters was probably small, a minority of a minority. But that minority mattered. It mattered because the ideas they carried were powerful, and because the prestige they had earned gave those ideas weight. A man who had served the Byzantine Emperor, who had seen Constantinople, who had gold in his purse and stories on his lips, such a man commanded attention when he spoke about how things might be done differently. His experience was authority. His survival was proof of competence. His wealth was evidence that the foreign ways worked. The transformation of Scandinavian society in the 11th and 12th centuries had many causes. The consolidation of royal power under kings like Harald Hardrada in Norway, the Christianization that replaced the old gods with new institutions, the economic changes that drew Scandinavia more deeply into European trade networks. All of these resulted from forces larger than any individual could control. But within that larger transformation, the Varangian experience was a thread, a current, a persistent influence. The men who had served the emperor knew what sophisticated states looked like. Some of them helped build simplified versions at home. We can trace this most clearly in the case of Harald himself. His reign in Norway, from 1046 to 1066, those 2 decades between his return from Constantinople and his death at Stamford Bridge, was marked by efforts to strengthen royal authority at the expense of local chieftains, to develop more systematic administration, to accumulate wealth through taxation and trade rather than merely through raiding. His methods were often brutal. He was not importing Byzantine civilization wholesale. He was adapting selected elements to Norwegian conditions, using Byzantine-style ambition to pursue distinctly Norwegian goals. But the Byzantine experience had shaped him. He had seen how empires worked. He tried, within the limits of what 11th century Norway could support, to build something that resembled what he had seen. He failed in the sense that Norway remained a peripheral kingdom, never approaching Byzantine wealth or sophistication. He succeeded in the sense that the Norwegian monarchy he strengthened survived him and eventually became one of the more stable kingdoms of medieval Europe. The experiment he attempted, importing imperial ideas to a non-imperial context, was repeated in various forms across the medieval world. The Varangians, as a whole, were participants in this experiment, whether they intended to be or not. But the Guard's significance extended beyond politics and administration. It also transformed how the Norse understood themselves. Before the Varangian experience, Scandinavian identity was local, tribal, tied to particular regions and family lineages. A man was Norwegian or Danish or Swedish only in the vaguest sense. What mattered was whether he was from Rogaland or Vestfold, whether his family had ties to this chieftain or that one. The wider Scandinavian identity, the sense of shared culture and language that we now call Viking, was something that existed more in the perception of outsiders than in the self-understanding of the Norse themselves. The Byzantine service changed this. In Constantinople, a man from Norway and a man from Sweden were both simply Varangians, northerners, axe-bearers, foreigners united by their foreignness. The distinctions that had seemed so important at home became irrelevant in the Mediterranean context. What mattered was the shared heritage, the language, the customs, the fighting style, the common background in a cold maritime world far removed from Byzantine sophistication. This experience of being categorized together, of being seen as a single group by outsiders, helped create the conditions for actual group identity. The Varangians who served together, regardless of their specific origins, developed a sense of shared membership in something larger than their home villages. They were the Northmen, the axe-wielders, the emperor's feared guard. When they returned home, they carried this expanded identity with them. The sagas that preserved Viking memory were largely written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, after the Viking Age proper had ended. The men who wrote them, Icelandic authors like Snorri Sturluson, were creating a shared past for a Nordic world that had become Christian, literate, and conscious of itself as a distinct cultural zone. The Varangian experience was part of what made this consciousness possible. The Guard had been a place where Norse identity was forged in the encounter with radically different others, where the fact of being Norse became salient precisely because it contrasted so sharply with being Byzantine. This is one of the profound ironies of the Varangian story. The Guard existed because Byzantine emperors wanted foreign warriors who had no local ties, No investment in the factional disputes of Constantinople, no reason for loyalty except pay and honor. The emperors got what they wanted, centuries of reliable service from men whose foreignness was their qualification. But that very foreignness, cultivated and maintained and institutionalized, helped create the conditions for a stronger Scandinavian identity back home. The Guard served Byzantine purposes while simultaneously serving as an incubator for Nordic self-consciousness. The physical traces of this exchange survive in scattered forms, runic inscriptions in the Hagia Sophia, yes, but also in other locations across the Byzantine world and its borders. At Piraeus, the port of Athens, a marble lion that now stands in Venice bears runic inscriptions that scholars have partially deciphered, Varangian graffiti, essentially, carved by guardsmen who found themselves in Greece and wanted to leave a mark. In the Hagia Sophia itself, several runic inscriptions have been found, carved into the marble balustrades of the upper gallery. One of them appears to read a name, Halvdan. Another is too worn to decipher. These marks are the authentic voices of the guardsmen themselves, not the reports of Byzantine chroniclers, not the romanticized sagas of later Icelandic writers, but the actual scratched evidence of Norse hands holding iron tools, carving letters into stone that had stood for centuries before they were born and would stand for centuries after they died. Artifacts traveled both ways. Byzantine relics and luxury goods made their way north, sometimes as gifts, sometimes as purchases, sometimes as plunder from the empire's misfortunes. Scandinavian metalwork and weaponry remained in Byzantine collections or were recycled into Mediterranean forms. The archaeological record is fragmentary but suggestive. Byzantine coins appear in Scandinavian hoards, far from any trade route that could explain their presence by commerce alone. Evidence, perhaps, of Varangian pay brought home and buried against future need. The literary traces are richer, but more problematic. The Norse sagas mention Varangian service frequently, but always from a northern perspective, always shaped by the concerns and conventions of Icelandic literature, rather than by any direct Byzantine testimony. Byzantine sources mention the Guard frequently enough, but typically in passing, as a detail in larger narratives about emperors and wars and court intrigues. Neither tradition tells us much about the inner experience of the guardsmen themselves, what it felt like to stand watch in the great palace, what they talked about in their barracks, how they understood the strange civilization they had pledged to defend. We are left, as so often with the past, with inference and imagination disciplined by evidence. We know that they came, we know that they served, we know that many died far from home, and that others returned bearing gold and stories and ideas that would ripple through their societies for generations. We know that the Guard endured for 3 centuries and declined with the empire it protected. We know that the connection it represented between the Norse world and the Byzantine, between the cold northern seas and the warm Mediterranean, between societies at vastly different levels of organizational complexity, was one of the remarkable cultural bridges of the medieval world. What we cannot know, what no scholarship can recover, is what it meant to the men who lived it. Imagine one of them. He is young, perhaps 20, perhaps less. He has left behind a family that may or may not see him again. He has traveled for months through increasingly foreign landscapes. He has arrived in a city that exceeds anything he imagined possible. He's been enrolled in the Emperor's Guard, given weapons, taught commands in a language he barely speaks. He stands his first watch in the great palace, in a corridor lit by oil lamps, surrounded by marble and silk and gold leaf, listening for sounds of danger in a building so vast that a man could wander for hours without finding his way out. What does he think? What does he fear? What does he hope? The sources do not say. They cannot say. The inner lives of medieval people are largely inaccessible to us, hidden behind languages we cannot fully understand and assumptions we cannot fully share. What we have instead are the structures they left behind, the institutions, the texts, the buildings, the objects, and from those structures we reconstruct what we can. The Varangian Guard was one such structure. It lasted longer than many kingdoms. It connected worlds that would otherwise have had little reason to connect. It transformed the lives of thousands of men who passed through it, and through them transformed the societies they came from. It died when the empire that created it died, leaving behind only traces, inscriptions, artifacts, stories, and the persistent influence of ideas that crossed borders because young men seeking gold were willing to carry them. The empire that created it was dying for a long time before it died. This is the truth that any account of the Varangian Guard must eventually confront. The Guard did not exist in isolation. It existed as part of a larger structure, and when that structure failed, the Guard failed with it. The end of the Varangians is inseparable from the end of Byzantium itself. A slow, grinding, centuries-long collapse that is one of the most studied and least understood catastrophes in human history. Begin in 1204. The date marks a rupture so profound that many historians consider it the true death of the Byzantine Empire, with everything that followed being merely a prolonged afterlife. The Fourth Crusade, launched ostensibly to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim control, never reached the Holy Land at all. Instead, through a combination of Venetian manipulation, Crusader debt, and Byzantine dynastic instability, the army that had set out to fight for Christ ended up sacking the greatest Christian city in the world. Constantinople fell to the Crusaders on April 12, 1204. What followed was 3 days of systematic plunder that stripped the city of accumulated treasures dating back to Constantine himself. Churches were desecrated, relics were stolen or destroyed, bronze statues that had stood for centuries were melted down for coin. The library, one of the last repositories of ancient knowledge, was scattered. Nuns were raped, citizens were murdered in the streets. The Crusaders, theoretically under the command of their own lords and the moral authority of the Pope, behaved with a savagery that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to medieval warfare. Where were the Varangians? The sources are frustratingly incomplete, but what evidence survives suggests they fought. A Byzantine chronicle mentions the Imperial Guard defending the palace precincts. A Crusader account notes fierce resistance from axe-wielding northerners in the final hours. But the Guard was not what it had been. The empire's long decline had reduced its numbers, compromised its equipment, diluted its recruitment with Greeks and others who lacked the traditional Varangian connection to the north. When Constantinople fell, the Guard fell with it, not through cowardice or betrayal, but through simple mathematics. There were not enough of them to hold against a determined army. The Crusaders established what they called the Latin Empire of Constantinople, a Catholic state imposed on Orthodox territory, ruled by Baldwin of Flanders and controlled in practice by Venetian commercial interests. The Byzantine government fragmented into successor states, the Empire of Nicaea in Asia Minor, the Despotate of Epirus in western Greece, the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. The Greek-speaking Orthodox civilization that had called itself Roman retreated into enclaves, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim what had been lost. The Varangian Guard, as an institution, effectively ceased to exist. There was no emperor in Constantinople to protect. The scattered successor states maintained their own guards, but these were reduced, impoverished shadows of the old imperial establishment. The flow of northern warriors that had sustained the Guard for 3 centuries slowed to a trickle and then stopped. Scandinavia itself was changing, converting to Christianity, consolidating into stable kingdoms, developing its own military institutions that no longer required young men to seek fortune in distant lands. For 57 years, the city that had been the heart of the Byzantine world remained in foreign hands. Then came Michael VIII Palaiologos. He was emperor of Nicaea, the most successful of the successor states, and he understood that the restoration of Constantinople was not merely a strategic objective, but a theological and symbolic necessity. Without the city, the empire was incomplete. Without the empire, Orthodox Christianity lacked its proper protector. Without that protection, the cosmic order that Byzantine ideology posited was fundamentally disordered. In 1261, through a combination of luck, timing, and the absence of the main Latin garrison on a raiding expedition, a Nicaean general named Alexios Strategopoulos slipped into Constantinople with a small force and seized it almost without a fight. Michael VIII entered the city through the Golden Gate on August 15, 1261, the feast day of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, patron of the city. He walked barefoot to the Hagia Sophia in a ceremony of deliberate humility that proclaimed the restoration of divine favor. The empire was reborn. But what was reborn was not what had been. The Latin occupation had done damage that could not be undone. The treasury was empty. The population was reduced. The infrastructure was decayed. The territorial base was a fraction of what it had been even in 1204, and the empire was surrounded by enemies, the Latin states that still held Greece, the Serbian kingdom expanding southward, the Bulgarian Tsardom pressing from the north, and most ominously, the Turkish Emirates multiplying across Anatolia. The Varangian Guard was reconstituted, but in diminished form. The sources from the restored empire mention the Guard occasionally, but the mentions become increasingly rare, increasingly ceremonial. The flow of Scandinavian recruits that had sustained the institution for 3 centuries had essentially ceased. The northern kingdoms had their own concerns now: dynastic struggles, crusades in the Baltic, the consolidation of Christian states that no longer sent their surplus warriors south. The men who served in the restored Guard were increasingly drawn from other sources: Greeks, remaining Latins who converted to Orthodox service, various mercenaries from across Europe and the Mediterranean. The Guard retained its ceremonial functions. Guardsmen still stood watch in the palace. They still carried axes, though the axes were increasingly symbolic. They still bore the name Varangian, though the ethnic connection to Scandinavia had become attenuated to the point of meaninglessness. What had been a fighting force became, gradually, a tradition maintained for its own sake, a reminder of imperial continuity in an empire that had little else to remind itself of former glories. The 14th century was a long, slow catastrophe. Civil wars between Byzantine factions opened the gates to Ottoman expansion. The Black Death, reaching Constantinople in 1347, killed perhaps a third of the population. The economy collapsed. The government could not pay its officials, let alone its soldiers. The empire that had once stretched from the Balkans to the Euphrates shrank to Constantinople itself, and a few scattered possessions in Greece and the Aegean. The last reliable references to the Varangian Guard date from the mid-14th century. By then, it had become unclear what the term even meant, whether it designated a specific military unit or had become merely a title, an honor attached to certain palace positions. The institution that had guarded emperors for 300 years faded into administrative obscurity, its members absorbed into other formations, or simply dismissed when the money ran out. What remained was the name. What remained were the stories. Consider what the Guard had witnessed in its centuries of existence: the coronation of emperors and the deposition of emperors, the triumph of Basil the Bulgar slayer and the disaster of Manzikert, the pomp of court ceremonies and the chaos of palace coups, the arrival of the First Crusade with its ambiguous mixture of threat and opportunity, the catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade and the 57 years of exile, the restoration and the long decline. Consider what the guardsmen had been across those centuries: adventurers and refugees, believers and cynics, loyal servants and occasional conspirators. They had protected emperors they despised and died for causes they barely understood. They had witnessed the inner workings of one of history's most sophisticated political systems. They had maintained, against all odds, a connection between the Norse world and the Byzantine world that outlasted the Viking Age itself. By 1453, when Sultan Mehmed II brought his army to the walls of Constantinople for the final siege, the Varangian Guard was a memory. The defenders of the city, perhaps 7,000 men against an Ottoman force of 80,000 or more, included Greeks, Italians, Catalans, and a few hundred others from various parts of Europe. Among them, almost certainly, were a handful of men who traced their ancestry to northern Europe. But they did not fight as Varangians. They did not carry the axes that had been the Guard's signature for 3 centuries. The institution was gone. Only echoes remained. Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine V Palaiologos, died fighting at the walls, his body never conclusively identified. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The great palace, where Varangians had stood watch for 300 years, fell into ruin and was eventually demolished. The empire that had claimed to be Rome, that had preserved Roman law and Greek learning and Christian faith through 1,000 years of invasions and disasters, ceased to exist. The Guard died with it. But death is not the same as disappearance. Ideas persist, patterns recur. The connection that the Varangians had represented between North and South, between warrior culture and bureaucratic state, between restless wandering and disciplined service, continued to manifest in different forms long after the institution itself was gone. Young men from marginal regions continued to seek fortune in the service of great empires. Military elites continued to form around foreign-born warriors whose lack of local ties made them trustworthy precisely because they had no one to trust but their employer. The Swiss Guard of the Vatican, established in 1506, drew on similar logic. The Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire, recruited from Christian populations and converted to Islam, represented another variation on the theme. The European colonial armies of later centuries, with their native auxiliaries and their foreign legions, continued the pattern. The American military of the present, with its offers of citizenship to non-citizen recruits, maintains a version of the arrangement that Basil II formalized 1,000 years ago. The specific institution was particular to its time and place. The underlying logic was universal. Reflect on what the Varangians accomplished in their 3 centuries of service. They did not build an empire. They did not conquer territory. They did not establish a dynasty or found a religion or write books that would be read for centuries. They served. They protected. They died, often violently, far from home. They sent gold back to families they would never see again. They returned, some of them, with stories that would shape how their societies understood the wider world. They were intermediaries. They were bridges. They were proof that the most unlikely connections are possible when enough individual human beings are willing to cross the distance between worlds. The distance was real. It cannot be overstated. A man leaving Norway or Iceland in the 10th or 11th century, bound for Constantinople, was undertaking a journey as momentous as any in human history. He was leaving behind everything familiar: language, religion, climate, social structure, material culture, and entering a world so different that it must have seemed at moments like another planet. The journey took months. It crossed climate zones, language families, religious boundaries, and civilizational frontiers. It required courage, or desperation, or perhaps just the kind of restless dissatisfaction that has driven young men toward the horizon in every society and every age. They made the journey. They served. They died or returned. And in doing so, they created one of the most remarkable cultural exchanges of the medieval world. The runic inscription in the Hagia Sophia is still there. Tourists walk past it without noticing. The stone it was carved into has been worn smooth by centuries of hands and bodies pressing against it, the letters themselves barely visible now, indecipherable without specialized knowledge. But the letters remain. Someone carved them 1,000 years ago, standing in a building that represented everything alien and magnificent about the civilization he had come to serve. He left his name, or a message, or perhaps just a memorial to the fact that he had been there, that he had seen this, that he had stood in this place where northern warriors were not supposed to stand. The name we can make out is Halfdan. That is all. Halfdan, a common Norse name meaning half-Dane, suggesting perhaps a man of mixed Danish and Norwegian ancestry, or perhaps just a name given by parents who did not think much about its etymology. We know nothing else about him. We do not know when he came to Constantinople, or how long he served, or what battles he fought, or whether he died in Byzantine service or returned home to tell his stories by a northern fire. We know only that he was there, that he carved his name, that the inscription survived. It is tempting to make too much of this. It is tempting to construct an entire narrative around Halfdan, to imagine his journey, his thoughts, his feelings as he stood in the Hagia Sophia with a knife in his hand and carved letters into the balcony rail. But the temptation must be resisted. We do not know, We cannot know. The sources do not permit it. What we can know is the structure. We can know that a system existed for 3 centuries that brought men like Halfdan from Scandinavia to Constantinople. We can know what they were paid, roughly. We can know what their duties included. We can know when the system flourished and when it declined. We can know the names of some emperors they served and some battles they fought. We can know that the connection persisted longer than most medieval institutions and that its end came not through any failure of the Guard itself, but through the larger failure of the empire it served. We can know that they were transformed. This is perhaps the most important thing. The men who joined the Varangian Guard as young Norse warriors left their service, if they survived, as something else entirely. They had learned Greek, or some functional approximation of it. They had absorbed Byzantine ideas about hierarchy, about ceremony, about the relationship between sacred and secular authority. They had worshipped in Orthodox churches and heard Orthodox liturgy, and perhaps absorbed, in ways they barely understood, Orthodox theology. They had eaten Mediterranean food and worn Mediterranean clothing and lived Mediterranean lives for years or decades. When they returned north, those who returned, they brought all of this with them. They brought gold, certainly. They brought weapons and luxury goods. But they also brought ideas, assumptions, aesthetic preferences, ways of understanding the world that had been shaped by their Byzantine experience. They became vectors of cultural transmission, carrying information from one civilization to another in an age when information traveled slowly and by human effort. The influence is impossible to quantify and impossible to deny. Norse art shows Byzantine influences. Norse Christianity in its early centuries shows traces of Orthodox practice and theology that probably traveled along Varangian routes. The very fact that Northern Europeans knew anything about the Byzantine world, its wealth, its sophistication, its religious authority, owed much to the men who had gone there and returned with stories. They were not conscious agents of cultural exchange. They were men seeking fortune and adventure, doing what young men have always done when their home societies cannot absorb their ambitions. But the effect of their seeking was to connect worlds that would otherwise have remained apart, to create channels through which ideas and objects and practices could flow. The channel closed when the Guard ceased to exist, but what had already flowed through it remained. The question that remains is the question of significance. Why does this matter? Why spend time and attention on an institution that died 700 years ago, that most people have never heard of, that left behind only fragmentary traces in an incomplete historical record? The answer has several parts. It matters because it happened. The past is not a series of lessons for the present. It is not a repository of examples to be mined for contemporary relevance. It is the actual story of actual human beings who lived and died and mattered as much as we matter, whose experiences were as real to them as ours are to us. The Varangians existed. Their existence deserves attention for its own sake, not because of what it might teach us, but because they were here, because they crossed thousands of miles to serve an empire they barely understood, because they died far from home in causes that meant nothing to them except money and honor and the strange loyalty that grows between soldiers and their comrades. It matters because it complicates easy narratives. The Vikings as raiders and destroyers is one story. The Vikings as explorers and settlers is another. The Vikings as imperial guardsmen, disciplined and loyal and essential to the functioning of one of history's most sophisticated states, is a third story that does not fit easily with the other two. All three are true. All three describe the same people in the same centuries. Human beings are not simple, and societies are not simple, and the past refuses to resolve into neat categories no matter how much we might prefer it to. It matters because the connection it represents between worlds we think of as separate, between peoples we think of as distinct, is itself significant. The medieval world was more connected than popular imagination suggests. Ideas and goods and people moved across boundaries we now think of as solid. Scandinavians served Byzantine emperors. Byzantines used Scandinavian warriors. The exchange was possible because both sides saw advantage in it, and the exchange persisted because it worked for 300 years well enough to be worth continuing. It matters because the Guard's end is inseparable from a larger catastrophe. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was one of the pivotal events of human history. It marked the end of an empire that had claimed continuity with ancient Rome. It marked the triumph of the Ottoman Turks and the beginning of centuries of Ottoman dominance in southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. It sent Greek scholars westward, carrying texts and ideas that would help spark the Renaissance. It shifted trade routes and political alignments and cultural boundaries in ways that are still visible on maps today. The Varangian Guard was a small part of that story. But small parts matter. The institution's decline tracked the empire's decline. Its end came because the empire's end came. Understanding the Guard helps us understand the larger structure it served, and understanding that structure helps us understand the world that emerged from its ruins. This is the final thing that must be said. The Varangians are gone. The emperors they served are gone. The empire is gone. Constantinople is Istanbul now. The Hagia Sophia is a mosque again after decades as a museum. The Great Palace is a memory beneath modern streets. Time has done what time does, erasing the particulars while leaving the shapes. But the runic inscription in the Hagia Sophia remains. Tourists walk past it every day, moving through a building that was a church for 900 years, a mosque for 500, a museum for 86, and is now a mosque again. Most of them do not notice the letters carved into the balcony rail. Why would they? The letters are worn. The language is dead. The man who carved them has been dust for 1,000 years. Yet the letters persist. They are there, right now, in the marble, waiting for anyone who knows how to read them. Halfdan was here. A man from the north came to this place, stood in this building, and left his name. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted proof that he had been part of something larger than himself. Perhaps that is what the Guard was, in the end. Proof. Proof that connections are possible across any distance. Proof that institutions can endure for centuries if they serve genuine needs. Proof that young men seeking fortune have always been willing to travel farther than anyone thought possible, and that the worlds they reach are always stranger than they imagined. The sun sets earlier in Constantinople than in Scandinavia. The light falls differently on the water. The air smells of different things, spices and dust and sea salt from a warmer sea. For 300 years, northerners stood in that light and breathed that air and watched over emperors who spoke languages they barely understood. They were far from home. They were essential. They were forgotten the moment they ceased to be useful. But the names, some of them, survive. Halfdan, carved in stone, still here. The empire fell around him. The world he knew is gone. But the inscription remains, worn smooth by centuries, barely legible now, waiting. The men from the north came south. They served. They died or returned. The current that carried them has run its course. The stone remembers.